All right, folks, this is take two. This is an educational series that we're doing on HF radio and HF propagation. And so this is teaching how an HF radio signal, and it's a little dry, I'm going to tell you that, but it's got good animations in it, and it'll give you a good understanding of how the radio signal actually leaves the antenna and bounces off of the atmosphere and comes back down and skip and a variety of other things. So highly educational.
Hello, and welcome to this presentation, Understanding HF Propagation.
And the link to this video in its entirety is in the chat. So, hope you enjoy it.
In this presentation, we'll introduce you to the basic concepts of HF propagation and explain how HF propagation is influenced by solar activity. HF stands for high frequency and is usually used to refer to frequencies in the range of 3 MHz to 30 MHz, although in many cases the practical definition of HF can be extended down as low as 1.5 MHz. This corresponds to wavelengths in the range of about 100 meters to about 10 meters. You'll sometimes also hear HF referred to, albeit somewhat imprecisely, as shortwave. The primary use of HF is for long-distance or even global communications. Broadcasters can reach listeners around the world using HF, and this global reach is also useful in many government and military applications. Amateur radio operators around the world also frequently use and experiment with HF. And as we'll see in this presentation, it's the unique properties of HF propagation that enable long-range communications or even global communications. Although propagation at HF can provide worldwide communications, HF propagation can also be highly variable compared to communications at other frequencies, such as at VHF and higher. As a practical matter, this means that the greatest challenge in HF is finding the optimum frequency for communicating with an intended destination under the current propagation conditions. Before we go into more detail about how this is done, let's briefly cover the three main HF propagation modes: line of sight, ground wave, and skywave. Line of sight is fairly easy to understand. Signals propagate in a straight, unobstructed path between the transmitter and the receiver. Line of sight is the only HF propagation mode which is fairly constant. Your ability to use line of sight to communicate with another station at a given location doesn't change much over periods of minutes, hours, days, months, years, etc. That said, HF isn't a very good choice for line of sight communications, and it's rarely used for this purpose. Because of the lower frequencies, HF requires large antennas, and bandwidth is also somewhat limited. There also tends to be much more noise at HF compared to higher frequencies. This can be a problem because the limited bandwidth at HF usually means communications are carried out over AM or single sideband, which are much more sensitive to noise than wider bandwidth FM. For these reasons, most line-of-sight communications are carried out at VHF or higher, not at HF. If we don't have a direct line of sight to another station, ground wave is a possible solution. Ground wave, sometimes called surface wave, involves signals propagating along the surface of the Earth. Interaction between the lower part of the transmitted wavefront and the Earth's surface causes the wave to tilt forward, allowing the signal to follow the curvature of the Earth, sometimes well beyond line of sight. Ground wave propagation is, however, highly dependent on two different factors: the conductivity of the surface and the frequency of the transmitted signal. In general, higher surface conductivity gives better results in the form of greater distances that can be covered. Salt water has excellent conductivity, especially compared to dry or rocky land, so ground wave is a good choice for ship-to-ship or ship-to-shore communications. With regards to frequency, ground wave works best for lower frequencies. For example, the theoretical range of a 150-watt transmitter at 7 MHz is 35 kilometers over land and close to 250 kilometers over the sea. At 30 MHz, however, our range falls to only 13 kilometers over land and just over 100 kilometers at sea. One of the most important propagation modes of HF is skywave, because it's skywave propagation that enables beyond line of sight or worldwide communications. In skywave, layers of ionized particles in the upper atmosphere refract HF signals back towards the Earth, allowing communications over many thousands of kilometers. The distances that can be covered by different frequencies are almost entirely a function of the state of these layers of ionized particles, collectively referred to as the ionosphere. In this presentation, we'll explain the different layers of the ionosphere, how the ionosphere is affected by the sun, and how we can both quantify the current state of the ionosphere and predict the future state of the ionosphere. The incident angle, or the angle at which a signal reaches the ionosphere, also plays an important role in how far a skywave signal will propagate. The radiation angle of an antenna is primarily a function both of the type of antenna and the location at which the antenna is installed. Higher placement of an antenna usually lowers the radiation and incident angles. And generally speaking, the lower the incident angle, the greater the distance that is covered by skywave propagation. Note, however, that so-called skip zones may be created depending on radiation or incident angle. In these zones, HF signals can't be received either via skywave or via ground wave propagation. In order to understand skywave propagation, we should start by explaining how ionization occurs in the Earth's atmosphere. When ultraviolet energy or radiation from the sun strikes gas atoms or molecules in the atmosphere, this energy can cause electrons to become detached. The result is a positive ion and, more importantly, a free electron. The Earth's magnetic field keeps these free electrons roughly in place. The level of ionization and the number of free electrons increases as the amount of sunlight striking a given part of the atmosphere increases. When that part of the atmosphere rotates away from the sun, that is, at night, the energy is removed and the ions recombine to form electrically neutral atoms or molecules. Note that recombination is a slower process than ionization. Atmospheric ionization increases rapidly at dawn, but decreases less rapidly after dark. As mentioned earlier, the region of the Earth's atmosphere that undergoes this ionization is collectively called the ionosphere. The level or density of ionization in the ionosphere is different at different altitudes, and areas with ionization peaks are often grouped into so-called layers or regions. The layers that are important for HF propagation are the D layer, from 60 to 100 kilometers, the E layer, from 100 to 125 kilometers, and the F layer, or layers, from about 200 to 275 kilometers. Note that these are only rough numbers. The thickness and altitude of ionospheric layers is never constant. The reason for defining these different layers is that each of these layers will refract and/or absorb HF signals in different ways. It's important to note that the ionosphere does not reflect signals, but rather refracts signals. The different electron densities at different altitudes is what makes this refraction possible. Let's start with the lowest level of the ionosphere, the D layer. The D layer only exists during daytime hours and disappears at night. Although the D layer is ionized by solar radiation, the density of free electrons in the D layer is too low to effectively refract HF signals, and therefore the D layer cannot be used for skywave propagation. Instead, the D layer acts as an absorber of HF signals. This absorption is higher for lower frequency signals than for higher frequency signals. Absorption also increases with increasing ionization, so absorption is usually highest at midday. For these reasons, the properties of D-layer absorption mean that higher frequency HF signals work better during the daytime, whereas lower frequency signals work better at night, after this layer has disappeared. The next highest layer, the E layer, is the lowest layer of the ionosphere that can refract HF signals back towards the Earth, and is the lowest layer that supports skywave propagation.
And so, a couple things here to help you remember. D layer is for the daytime. And you want to use higher frequencies during the daytime, just like high noon, higher frequencies. At night, you lay down, so you want the lower frequencies. And the E and the F layer is evening, so on and so forth. Earth, you'll get it here.
Compared to the other layers, it's relatively thin, usually around 10 kilometers or so. The E layer is much more dense, that is, ionized, during the day, but unlike the D layer, it doesn't completely disappear at night. Aside from mostly short-range daytime communications and a few other special cases, E layer propagation is not commonly found in HF. Note, however, that at VHF, the E layer is very important and supports some rather exotic and less predictable propagation modes, such as sporadic E, that make long-distance communication over thousands of kilometers possible, even at the relatively high frequencies of VHF. The F layer is the most important for skywave propagation. During the day, the F layer splits into two sublayers, F1 and F2, which merge back into a single layer again at night. Compared to the D and E layers, the height of the F layers changes considerably based on things such as time of day,
And the F layer is the furthest out there.
season, and solar conditions. More on this shortly. The lower F1 layer primarily supports short to medium distance communications during daylight hours. The F2 layer, on the other hand, is present more or less around the clock. It has the highest altitude and the highest ionization of all the layers, and therefore is responsible for the vast majority of long-distance HF communications. The degree to which the different layers of the ionosphere refract and/or absorb radio frequency signals is largely a function of that signal's frequency. The general rule for HF skywave communications is to always use the highest possible frequency that will reach a given station or destination. This is called the maximum usable frequency, or MUF. Signals whose frequencies are higher than the MUF will not be refracted by the ionosphere. Usually, the MUF increases with increasing ionization. Another important frequency threshold is
And the muff muffles them.
something called the lowest usable frequency, or LUF. When the signal frequency is at or below the LUF, communication becomes difficult or impossible due to signal loss or attenuation. So we want to choose a frequency that's somewhere between the LUF and the MUF. There is one very important difference, though, between MUF and LUF. Because the LUF is mostly determined by noise, using higher transmit powers, a better antenna, etc., can improve or lower the LUF. MUF, on the other hand, is entirely a function of the ionosphere. You can't improve or increase the MUF by using more power or a better antenna. The MUF simply is what it is. And as we'll see shortly, if the LUF becomes greater than the MUF, no HF communication is possible.
And that's why I was saying that it muffs it. It muffles it. You can't do anything about it. The maximum usable frequency is what it is, and like he just said, when the LUF becomes higher than the MUF, you can't use HF at all. And that does happen. And we need to pay close attention to this, because as we go into a grand solar minimum, all of these characteristics will go to a low solar activity state, which means you better have your shit all in one sock and have yourself a good antenna.
One way to determine the MUF is purely through experimentation, but there are also methods for estimating the MUF using something called the critical frequency. The process for measuring the critical frequency is as follows. Pulses at various frequencies are transmitted vertically by equipment called ionosondes. Depending on the frequency of the pulse, these pulses are returned by different layers of the ionosphere, and we can use the return time to estimate the heights of the different layers. Once we reach a certain frequency, the pulses are not returned by the ionosphere.
And this is something that we used to do at one of my old workplaces, was test this so they knew which antenna array to use to talk to whatever country that you wanted to talk to or part of the world.
Instead continue on into space. This is the critical frequency. Critical frequency is a function of both the current ionization level as well as the measurement location. It's measured regularly at hundreds of locations around the world.
And my place was one of them.
Mathematically speaking, the maximum usable frequency is the critical frequency divided by the cosine of the angle of incidence. If we send a signal straight up at 90 degrees, MUF and critical frequency are the same. But as a practical matter, the maximum usable frequency is usually estimated at 3 to 5 times the critical frequency. Critical frequency is one way of quantifying the state of the ionosphere, but it is an active test. We transmit signals and measure the return signals. In addition to critical frequency, there are 3 common passive methods that can be used to quantify the state of the ionosphere. The first of these is sunspot number, which can be used to predict the level of atmospheric ionization. The second is the solar flux index, which is an actual measurement of ionization. There are also 2 geomagnetic indices, the A index and the K index, which give an indication of the impact of solar particles on the Earth's magnetic field. Taken together, these quantities provide a good indication of the current state of the ionosphere and can be used to predict HF propagation. Let's take a look at each of these 3 quantities in a bit more detail. Sunspots are, relatively, cooler surface regions of the Sun. Relatively, in this case, means they have temperatures of about 3,000 Kelvin versus the normal 6,000 Kelvin seen elsewhere. After they appear, sunspots last between a few days and a few months. Sunspots are associated with powerful magnetic fields, and these fields affect how much radiation is given off by the Sun. The greater the number of sunspots, the higher the level of solar activity and radiation. And because of this, more sunspots generally means higher atmospheric ionization, a higher MUF, and better overall HF propagation. The quantitative measure of sunspots is sunspot number, which is a daily measurement of sunspots. Note, however, that sunspot number isn't simply a count of the number of sunspots. It also takes into account additional factors like the size and grouping of sunspots. Sunspot numbers are recorded by a number of solar observatories around the world, and sunspot number values range from 0 to a maximum recorded value of about 250. As mentioned a moment ago, more sunspots, or a higher sunspot number, almost always means better HF propagation. It's also worth noting that sunspot data have been collected for almost 400 years, giving us valuable information on how the number of sunspots changes over time. And sunspot numbers do change over time. In fact, sunspot activity follows a roughly 11-year solar or sunspot cycle, as shown in this graph. Generally speaking, sunspot numbers are usually around 150 at the peak of a cycle, during which time HF propagation is very good on most frequencies, including higher frequencies. At the bottom or trough of the sunspot cycle, sunspot numbers close to 0, meaning much poorer HF propagation. Given the period of the sunspot cycle, it should be clear that sunspot cycle is only good for predicting long-term HF propagation, that is, in terms of years, and over this time period it is fairly reliable. It's also, however, worth noting that at several points in history, for example in the late 1600s and the early 1800s, sunspot numbers stayed low for several decades.
And that was because we were in grand solar minima, which is what we're about to go into again,
creating so-called minimums or minima with very little solar activity. The reasons for these minima are still very much a mystery.
And I responded to him and told him that no, it's not a mystery. It's because of the electromagnetic waves in the sun going out of phase, and he should consult Dr. Valentina Zarkova. In fact, let me see if his... Wow, it looks like he deleted my comment. Interesting.
We can also quantify solar activity by measuring the level of solar noise, or flux, at a frequency of 2800 MHz. These measurements are reported as the solar flux index, with values given in so-called solar flux units. Measured solar flux values generally fall in the range of about 50 during a solar cycle minimum to about 300 during a solar cycle maximum. Since solar flux is a measurement, not an observation, it tends to be more consistent and reliable than sunspot number, but it also doesn't have the same 400-year history of values. However, solar flux values tend to correlate quite well with sunspot numbers. Like sunspot number, higher values of solar flux mean higher maximum usable frequencies and better HF propagation. Sunspot number and solar flux index are valuable measures of longer-term variations in solar radiation. The ionosphere is also affected by shorter duration events occurring on the sun. The most important of these are solar flares, which are a type of eruption on the surface of the sun. Solar flares cause a rapid rise in both X-ray and ultraviolet radiation, as well as the ejection of both low and high-energy particles. Solar flares are essentially unpredictable, but they do occur more commonly during peaks in the 11-year sunspot cycle. Solar flares have a significant effect on HF propagation because they can lead to sudden ionospheric disturbances, polar cap absorption, as well as both geomagnetic and ionospheric storms. As the name implies, a sudden ionospheric disturbance is sudden. It occurs about 8.5 minutes after a flare, that is, at the same time the flare becomes visibly detectable on the Earth, and is caused by the arrival of solar radiation. This radiation causes delayer ionization, and hence delayer absorption, to increase rapidly, starting at the lower frequencies and moving upwards. The affected frequencies are often almost completely blacked out. Fortunately, a sudden ionospheric disturbance only impacts the sunlit hemisphere, and tends to last a relatively short time, typically an hour or so. And in some cases, smaller solar flares can actually enhance HF propagation by increasing ionization at higher frequencies without a corresponding increase in delayer absorption. The next effect of a solar flare is something called polar cap absorption. The high-energy particles emitted by a flare reach the Earth several hours later, and the Earth's magnetic field prevents them from entering except at the poles. When they enter the atmosphere, these particles can increase delayer absorption in the polar regions, and this effect can last for several days. During this time, HF signals traveling through or near the poles will be blocked by this increased attenuation, but paths that do not go near the poles may remain relatively unaffected during this event. Geomagnetic storms are caused by lower energy particles arriving at the Earth. This occurs 20 to 40 hours after a solar flare. These particles can also be generated during something called a coronal mass ejection, which can occur independently of a solar flare. In either case, these particles can cause geomagnetic storms. Geomagnetic storms produce visible aurora, but they also can interfere with GPS signals, satellites in general, terrestrial power distribution networks, etc. Geomagnetic storms don't directly interfere with HF propagation, but they can create ionospheric storms. Ionospheric storms lower the maximum usable frequency and degrade HF propagation. And as mentioned earlier, if the MUF becomes higher than the LUF, an ionospheric storm can create a complete HF skywave blackout. One final note. It's possible to have a geomagnetic storm without an ionospheric storm, but the converse is not true. All ionospheric storms start out as geomagnetic storms. Sunspot number and solar flux index can be used to quantify ionospheric conditions, but to quantify geomagnetic conditions we use A and K indices. In general, lower values for A and K mean a more stable ionosphere, although, as we just mentioned, in some cases a geomagnetic storm may not lead to an ionospheric storm. A and K are measured at observatories around the planet, and these local values can be averaged to produce planetary values. One of the biggest differences between these two indices is that A is calculated daily, whereas K is measured every 3 hours. Higher values of K indicate a current or ongoing geomagnetic event, whereas A is useful in knowing how long this disturbance has been occurring. Let's summarize what we've learned. Global HF communications are usually based on skywave propagation rather than on direct line of sight or ground wave propagation. In skywave, signals are refracted by the ionosphere, although the effect of some layers is more to absorb signals than to refract them. Whether or not a signal is refracted or absorbed by the ionosphere is largely a function of 3 things: the frequency of the signal, the incident angle, and the amount of ionization in the upper atmosphere. Generally speaking, this ionization increases during daylight hours while the sun is illuminating that side of the Earth. On a longer time scale, ionization also increases as the number of sunspots increases, the number of sunspots following a roughly 11-year solar cycle. Aside from these semi-regular effects, certain types of solar events can unexpectedly or unpredictably disrupt the ionosphere and hence HF propagation. Solar flares are the most common of these, and flares can lead to so-called sudden ionospheric disturbances, polar cap absorption, and both geomagnetic and ionospheric storms. Coronal mass ejections are less common, but often a more severe, source of geomagnetic storms. And finally, we can quantify the current state of the ionosphere and/or make predictions about HF propagation based on measurements such as sunspot number, solar flux index, and the A and K magnetic indices. This concludes our presentation, Understanding HF Propagation. Thanks for watching. Presentation, Understanding HF Propagation. Hello, and welcome to this presentation, Understanding NIVIS. This presentation provides a short introduction to the fundamental technical principles of NIVIS, or Near Vertical Incidence Skywave, the most common types of NIVIS antennas, as well as the reasons why NIVIS plays an important role in HF communications. This presentation assumes a basic knowledge of HF radio propagation, including the structure of the ionosphere and both ground wave and skywave propagation. If you're unfamiliar with these topics, you might want to watch the presentation Understanding HF Propagation before beginning this presentation. We'll start our discussion of NIVIS with a short review of traditional skywave propagation. Skywave is one of the most important HF communications modes because it enables beyond line of sight and even worldwide communications. In skywave, layers of ionized particles in the upper atmosphere refract HF signals back towards Earth, allowing communications over many thousands of kilometers. The distances that can be covered by different frequencies are largely a function of the state of these layers of ionized particles, collectively referred to as the ionosphere. One of these layers, the D layer, acts to absorb signals and helps determine the minimum frequency that can be used. The lower the frequency of a signal, the more heavily it's attenuated by the D layer. Another layer, the F layer, refracts signals to allow communications well beyond line of sight, and the level of F layer ionization determines the maximum usable frequency. In addition to the amount and nature of F layer ionization, the incidence angle, or the angle at which a signal reaches the ionosphere, also plays an important role in how far a skywave signal will propagate. The radiation angle or takeoff angle of an antenna is primarily a function of both the type of antenna and the location at which the antenna is installed. Higher placement of an antenna usually lowers its radiation angle. And generally speaking, the lower the incidence angle, the greater the distance covered by skywave propagation. Note, however, that so-called skip zones may be created depending on radiation or incident angle. In these zones, HF signals can't be received either via skywave or via ground wave propagation. NIVIS, or Near Vertical Incident Skywave, is a special case of skywave propagation that enables both skip zone coverage as well as coverage in rough terrain, where ground wave or low-angle skywave signals might be blocked. NIVIS is implemented using an antenna with a very high radiation angle, typically 75 degrees or more, transmitting on lower HF frequencies. The nearly vertical takeoff angle of these signals means that they're returned to Earth relatively close to the transmitter. Typically, coverage is on the order of several hundred kilometers. This range, combined with the easy setup of most NIVIS antennas, makes this technology very well suited for applications that require ad hoc communications in possibly challenging terrain, such as military operations or disaster relief operations, where the existing communications infrastructure may have been damaged or destroyed. We'll start our discussion of NIVIS by explaining the advantages and disadvantages of NIVIS, and how NIVIS antennas are different from those used in traditional HF skywave communications. NIVIS has a number of purely technical advantages. The first of these is that NIVIS is more resistant to fading and provides a more constant signal level compared to traditional skywave propagation. Furthermore, the near vertical incidence angle of NIVIS means a shorter path through the D layer and less D layer absorption. In addition, a shorter overall path length reduces attenuation between transmitter and receiver. Attenuation of the signal due to terrain is minimal or non-existent because there's line-of-sight propagation between the transmitter and the ionosphere, and between the ionosphere and the receiver. This line-of-sight propagation also helps to reduce fading due to multipath. All of these factors mean that NIVIS works relatively well at low power levels, which is particularly important for portable or battery-powered operation in the field. And as we'll see shortly, NIVIS antennas provide roughly omnidirectional coverage. This omnidirectional pattern means that antenna orientation or azimuth is relatively unimportant, which in turn permits a great deal of flexibility in the setup and sighting of NIVIS antennas. In addition to these purely technical benefits, NIVIS also provides many operational benefits, particularly in a military environment. NIVIS signals generally have a lower probability of intercept than conventional HF skywave signals. This lower probability of intercept comes from the fact that NIVIS can operate at lower power levels, and also from its vertically oriented radiation pattern. Both of these make it significantly more difficult to DF, or use direction finding, to locate a NIVIS station, particularly for ground-based DF stations. Remember that the energy from a NIVIS antenna propagates upwards in a narrow pattern, and returns from the ionosphere with roughly equal strength over the coverage area. There's no strong ground wave signal component that can be used for taking a bearing. Conversely, it's also difficult to jam NIVIS signals using a ground wave jammer. NIVIS antenna patterns are designed to have very low or poor gain at traditional ground wave angles, and therefore will also not receive ground wave jamming signals as strongly. NIVIS antennas are mounted comparatively low to the ground, making them discreet and difficult to notice. Being low to the ground also makes NIVIS antennas easy to erect, and many can be set up by a single person. And finally, since the radiation angle is roughly vertical, there's no need to control the high ground to make effective use of NIVIS. Obstructions in the horizontal plane, like trees, mountains, buildings, etc., are much less important than in traditional skywave propagation. There are, however, some disadvantages when using NIVIS. One of the most important of these is that NIVIS only works at lower frequencies. We'll discuss this in more detail shortly. The nature of NIVIS antenna patterns and propagation also means that NIVIS has a limited range, typically only hundreds of kilometers, compared to the thousands of kilometers that can be achieved using traditional low-incidence skywave communication. Furthermore, optimum results require the use of NIVIS antennas on both the transmit and receive stations, although this requirement is somewhat looser for receive-only antennas. An additional potential disadvantage of using NIVIS is the fact that both atmospheric and man-made noise tend to be higher at the lower frequencies that are used in NIVIS communications. To make effective use of NIVIS, we must choose frequencies that are low enough to be refracted by the F layer of the ionosphere when arriving with a very high incidence angle. Signals with too high of a frequency will simply pass through the F layer and continue on into space. NIVIS also requires the use of frequencies that are high enough that they're not excessively attenuated by the D layer. Remember that D layer absorption is highest for low-frequency signals. In order to balance out these two somewhat conflicting requirements, NIVIS operation uses frequencies in the range of approximately 2 to 10 MHz. Like all other skywave propagation, the maximum and minimum frequencies depend on the level of atmospheric ionization, and this in turn depends on things like sunspot number or solar flux index, the time of day, the season, and any abnormal solar events. For example, during solar minima, the maximum usable frequency for NIVIS may be only 6 to 8 MHz. On average, however, NIVIS frequencies range from 4 to 8 MHz during the day and from 2 to 4 MHz at night, but as mentioned earlier, this can vary significantly. The specific frequencies used can be manually chosen by an operator based on experience and various ionospheric measurements, or the frequency can be automatically chosen using techniques such as automatic link establishment or ALE. NIVIS is essentially an antenna technology, so we'll begin our discussion of NIVIS by contrasting it with traditional HF skywave antennas. Most antennas intended for HF skywave communication are designed to have a low radiation or takeoff angle. This lower angle means a lower angle of incidence with the ionosphere, and hence longer distances due to lower refraction angles. In this application of HF skywave, an antenna that sends too much energy vertically is sometimes unflatteringly referred to as a cloud warmer. On the other hand, NIVIS antennas are specifically designed and installed in order to have this high radiation angle, typically 75 degrees or higher, which means that the majority of power is going up instead of going out. As we'll see, there are a number of ways to do this, but the most common method is using an antenna that's located close to the ground. And just as with traditional skywave antennas, an antenna tuning unit may be needed when using a NIVIS antenna, especially if the antenna is being used over a wide frequency range and or as a field expedient antenna.
But you see, we at KLW World News have found the antenna that does not need a frequency tuner. That's one more piece of equipment you've got to carry that can fail, and then you're screwed. You're much better to have an antenna that will operate on all frequencies, and then you don't have that problem.
One of the best ways to understand the difference between traditional low incidence angle skywave antennas and NIVIS antennas is to compare their antenna patterns. Since NIVIS can be implemented as a dipole, we'll compare a standard HF dipole with a NIVIS dipole. A standard HF dipole is usually mounted at a height that produces a relatively low elevation angle, as seen in the diagram on the left. The relationship between elevation angle and antenna height is somewhat complex, but generally speaking, the higher a dipole is mounted above the ground, the lower its elevation or takeoff angle. A lower elevation angle works well for long-distance HF skywave communications because we can achieve greater distances when the transmitted signal is incident to the ionosphere at lower angles. A dipole being used for NIVIS is characterized by a much higher or more vertical elevation pattern, as shown in the diagram on the right. As we'll discuss shortly, the primary method for creating this type of vertical radiation pattern is by moving the antenna closer to the ground. This higher elevation angle is necessary for NIVIS, but clearly would not yield satisfactory results if used for traditional long-distance skywave communications. A half-wave dipole suspended at normal heights above ground for traditional HF skywave communications has a directional pattern, with the majority of gain being broadside to the antenna, shown here in red. In a typical NIVIS antenna,
and this is what I was worried about, and this is what we want to use. We don't want to talk around the world. We don't want to talk all the way across the United States. We want to be able to talk to the next station that is 200, 300, 500 miles away.
Azimuth pattern is roughly omnidirectional, meaning the orientation of the NIVIS antenna is relatively unimportant. If we were to rotate the dipole orientation by 90 degrees, the azimuth pattern would remain essentially the same. The azimuth pattern of our NIVIS antenna also shows that coverage is fairly uniform within the receive area. The NIVIS antenna does not favor one horizontal direction over another. This is especially important in situations where the location of the receiving station is not known, there are multiple receiving stations, or when the receiving station is on the move. These are typical military and/or disaster relief scenarios. In these types of situations, a directional antenna pattern could be counterproductive, since there may be no reliable way to know in which direction the antenna should be pointed. NIVIS describes a certain type of antenna, or more precisely, a certain radiation pattern or elevation angle produced by an antenna. There are, however, many different types of antennas that can be used or adapted to produce the typical NIVIS antenna pattern. Given the most common applications of NIVIS, so-called field expedient antennas, that is, antennas which are designed for portability and ease of setup, are often preferred. The most common types of antennas found in NIVIS applications are dipoles and inverted Vs, which are a variant of the standard horizontal dipole. Unbalanced wire antennas are also used in NIVIS. And there are also a number of different types of vehicle-mounted antennas. We'll discuss all of these shortly. Other types of antennas found are fixed-site applications, where low profile, portability, and/or ease of setup are less of a concern. These include conical spiral and vertical log periodic antennas. The standard half-wavelength dipole used widely for low-angle HF skywave propagation can also be adapted for use in NIVIS applications. A traditional skywave dipole is usually positioned roughly half a wavelength above ground. In order to create a high radiation angle, a NIVIS dipole needs to be much lower, usually around 0.2 wavelengths above the ground. For example, if the operating frequency were 7 MHz, a NIVIS dipole should be erected approximately 8 meters above the ground. Generally speaking, the lower the active element, the higher the radiation angle. To some extent, the optimum antenna height is also a function of ground conductivity. The higher the conductivity, the lower the optimal height. Because of this, the use of an optional reflector element has sometimes been recommended, for example, when the soil has very low conductivity, such as sand or rock, or if the dipole is high above the ground. It does, however, remain unclear how much of an advantage this optional reflector provides, and in most cases, NIVIS dipoles do not have a reflector installed underneath them. One final observation on dipoles. If a single dipole is used for operation over a wide frequency range, an antenna tuning unit is often needed. But a set of dipoles, or a so-called fan dipole, can also be used for NIVIS applications to provide better matching over a wider frequency range. An inverted V is a variant of the horizontal dipole, where the center of the dipole is supported by a vertical mast, and the ends are often close to or near the ground. A very common implementation of the inverted V in NIVIS uses two dipoles, often positioned at roughly right angles to each other. This arrangement is sometimes referred to as a turnstile antenna. Using a pair of dipoles helps to overcome any polarization-related fading, and enables use of circular polarization. One of the main advantages of an inverted V over a standard horizontal dipole is that this type of antenna is easy to erect. It has only one central support, and therefore can be raised by a single person. When using an inverted V for NIVIS, the apex or peak of the mast should, however, be kept low, usually only slightly higher than the height of a horizontal dipole. A lower height mast also ensures that the apex angle remains low, which is important for obtaining the desired vertical radiation pattern. Dipoles are balanced antennas, but unbalanced antennas can also be used for NIVIS. An inverted L is one example of an unbalanced NIVIS antenna. The name inverted L refers to the shape of the antenna. It's most commonly created by connecting a horizontal flat top to a vertical down lead. The antenna then works against ground, or against a counterpoise if necessary. Like most other unbalanced antennas, an inverted L radiates along its entire length if the radio is connected to the end of the wire. As we'll see shortly, inverted Ls are also a popular choice for vehicle-mounted NIVIS antennas. NIVIS antennas can and often are deployed on vehicles. Loops are a popular choice for vehicle-mounted NIVIS antennas because they allow the use of NIVIS even when the vehicle is in motion. The standard vertical whip antenna found on many vehicles is a poor choice for NIVIS due to the nature of its radiation pattern. But this type of antenna can often be bent or tied into a horizontal position for use as a NIVIS antenna. In this configuration, the best performance is usually achieved by tying the antenna backwards, that is, away from the vehicle. Bending the mast backwards has the advantage of reducing out-of-phase currents generated in the bodywork of the vehicle, but this also usually forces the vehicle to be stationary. The whip can be tied or fastened in the forward position, that is, over the vehicle, in order to allow the antenna to be used in motion, although at the cost of lowered efficiency and a less optimal radiation pattern. Generally speaking, a proper dedicated loop antenna is a better choice than an improvised loop antenna made by bending a whip in either direction.
Okay, but there's a couple little tricks here. On bending this whip right here, what you want to do is you want to have a string that comes and bends the antenna back here, so that it's just this little part back here that's bent, and then you've got a string that holds this, and then you have a longer string that comes up and holds this, and this is wiggly up here, so this isn't brought all the way down here, it's more vertical right here. So only this part right back here is what is bent. So you put a string on it here and a string on it up here, and it has just very little arch as opposed to this curvature. Redneck HF trick. Wonder where I learned that.
Here are some additional images showing mobile NIVIS antenna implementations. The first is a loop-style antenna, in this case mounted on the deck of a ship. Another common NIVIS antenna variant used in mobile applications is the so-called towel bar, as seen here. Towel bar antennas have the advantage of being low profile and sturdy,
and we used to put those on the tops of vehicles so they look like luggage racks.
And a single towel bar is one of the most common methods of deploying NIVIS on an airborne platform. A double towel bar arrangement increases the effective size of an antenna and therefore increases the antenna's bandwidth performance. Note that towel bar antennas can be implemented to operate as dipoles, loops, or inverted L-type antennas. One final general note about NIVIS antennas. In addition to maximizing high-angle skywave signals, a NIVIS antenna should also minimize any incoming low-angle ground wave signals. This is important because if a station receives a signal via both skywave and ground wave, the interaction of these two signals can lead to destructive interference, distortion, and/or fading. Minimizing ground wave signals also has several additional technical and operational advantages. Most noise sources are typically close to the ground, so minimizing ground wave reception can also reduce the impact of these noise sources. Similarly, minimizing the reception of ground wave signals also reduces the effectiveness of ground wave-based jamming. And since a well-designed and properly installed NIVIS antenna radiates most of its power upwards, there's much less power that can be detected and located by ground-based radiolocation or direction finding systems. Let's summarize what we've learned. NIVIS, or Near Vertical Incidence Skywave, is a special type of skywave propagation that uses antennas which are designed and installed in order to produce very high elevation or takeoff angles, typically 75 degrees or more. Unlike traditional low-angle skywave signals, the signals from a NIVIS antenna are returned from the ionosphere almost vertically, and this is what gives NIVIS its main characteristics. The first of these is that NIVIS can provide coverage in so-called skip zones that can be created by the lower elevation angles used in traditional skywave communications. NIVIS is also useful in communicating within areas where ground wave is impractical, such as mountainous or jungle regions. The roughly omnidirectional coverage pattern provided by NIVIS makes antenna sighting and orientation less critical, and also facilitates communication with mobile stations or with stations whose locations are not well known. In addition, it makes NIVIS well suited for use with temporary or field expedient antennas. From an operational standpoint, using NIVIS decreases probability of intercept, complicates ground-based direction finding, and also provides greater immunity to ground wave jamming. The main challenge when using NIVIS is that it only works well at lower HF frequencies, typically in the range of 2 to 10 MHz, with a maximum frequency being a function of time of day and current solar conditions. NIVIS is an antenna-based technology that can be implemented using a variety of different antennas. One of the more commonly encountered categories of NIVIS antennas is one or more dipoles mounted close to the ground, either horizontally or in an inverted V configuration. Unbalanced antennas, often inverted Ls, can also be used, and there are various types of loop antennas which are particularly useful in vehicle-mounted or mobile applications. This concludes our presentation, Understanding NIVIS. Thanks for watching.
All right, so here the link is to that video in its entirety, and we're gonna see what this is.
Well, I'm not sure if I
know
introduce
this guy.
myself, I know who I am. They'll come after me. My name's Stan Broadway, N8VHL. I'm in Central Ohio, Ohio SEC, also on the Hurricane Net, do some other stuff. I've been licensed since 1979. I'm a code extra, so I can pull a little snobbery off. What I want to do here is talk about something that we all absolutely know about, and I don't want to put myself out as an expert on any of this. Uh, I own an antenna analyzer, so that makes me an expert, right? We want to talk about NVIS antennas tonight and next week, near vertical incident skywave antennas. We've already been talking about those kind of things, and I'm sure that this is not going to be a foreign topic for everybody. I decided to do the bragging up front. We set up an NVIS day in Ohio back in 2015. It was kind of a new idea, and the purpose of this was to just get people on the air. The premises were to get together with a group, have some fun, try different antenna designs, research them ahead of time, determine how effective your coverage is from each antenna. It was a non-contest environment on 40 meters, and get prepared to use the best designs for go boxes, and take a minute or two in the middle of the day and fire up the barbecue grill and have some fun. Most of the time, we did have fun with this. A lot of the old heads, now understand with amateur radio, there's a few universal things that strike our tone and wake us back up from the doldrums. And one of those is definitely messing with antennas, whether you're talking about 2 meters or 160 or below. Um, and all of our people seem to have a great deal of fun with this. We did have over 100 stations on the air throughout Ohio, and we were we basically flooded 40 meters for the time, which is good. And then the front rolled across Ohio, and that kind of put the kibosh on some of it. Prior to the front, some of the guys in Cleveland off of Lake Erie were getting 30-degree weather with high winds. So they were not particularly happy with the date that we picked, but we wanted to put something together prior to the spring, prior to field day, so they could test the antennas that they tried and perhaps put them to use in some of their events. So after all of that, did we prove anything? Eh. Terrain, surroundings, construction, all of that can have an effect. Ohio is relatively flat. With that being the case, we were kind of hoping to get at least a consensus on what kind of antennas would be good. And we did see a variety of antennas. Most frequently, we were based on the simple dipole. There were end feds, loops. Somebody even put together a Moxom on 40 that was aimed straight upward, which I thought was kind of interesting. It didn't do a bad job. But we were not able to produce any engineering level reports or charts or graphs citing any one NVIS antenna as being the best. So we decided to throw caution to the wind in 2016 and do it over again. Unfortunately, in 2016, it was also the launch of Parks on the Air, and they picked the same Saturday we did for their activity. And it just absolutely clobbered 40 meters. We did try to make an audible to switch to 80 meters. Not everybody heard. For those who did stick with it, it was a success. For 2017, we added the concept of anchor stations, where we had half a dozen stations that were on the air consistently through the day. And these are short days, 10 to 4, so that a station could.
And that's what we're going to do with KLW World News is we're going to have anchor stations. And different stations around those stations will communicate with those anchor stations, and those anchor stations will be the stations that get the news and put it out.
Try an antenna against two or three of these anchors and then get a real specific signal report, then change antennas and hit the same anchors. So you have some kind of consistent wall to bounce your signal off of to see which one is actually performing the best for you. For 2018, we added digital communications, and we were pretty much committed to both 40 and 80 meters for that. 2019 and 2020 is the same. Now, for 21, we're coming up on April 24th for our NVIS Day this year. We're planning to incorporate the Texas power down black sky version of NVIS. We've already pretty much got our antennas figured out. There's no reason to go back and redesign things. So what we're going to do this year is ask the guys to go out, do the same kind of thing, get together in a group, try any new designs you think of, but this time we're going to be using off-grid power, and we're going to try to establish a hierarchy of nets based on our districts in Ohio, and have the stations send a simple message once they get set up. In other words, instead of just randomly trying antenna signals, this idea of getting a message through while everything else is down makes it a little more challenging. So we think that's going to work. Now, you gotta love the Earth and the ionosphere. Couple of ways HF energy travels, you all know this, you should. Skywave bounces off the ionosphere. That's the particular wave of choice for me because I like DX. Ground wave is a localized pattern and gets you in close, but what about in between? One of the things that we first do when we try to build antennas as amateurs, we get our first license, the normal ham wisdom that all the old guys will tell us is, well, you got to put them up high. The higher the better. No matter what's going on, you need the height. So the takeoff angle from a high antenna is lower to the horizon. It bounces further away. That makes sense, right? Well, when, there we go, anything too low and the radiation would go straight up, we used to derisively refer to that antenna as a cloud burner. But it turns out that's exactly what we need in NVIS work. Here's the juice. A low antenna height is helped by reflection from the Earth. The RF waves go almost straight upward. They bounce back down much closer to your originating station. Thus, it's possible to communicate with, say, within a state where you might not be able to get there on HF any other way. If there are hills, mountains, large cities in between, this is also a big plus. Who thought this stuff up? Well, it turns out back in World War II, the world was absolutely enamored with the Enigma machine. You know, that's the one where they were coding messages and everybody got...
Dow, are you talking about from that previous chart there? Where are you getting the 26.25 feet? That's for that frequency, I guess. It varies with the frequency and what you want, but we're going after Invis is what we want.
When, there we go, anything too
low... The lower
low,
the frequency, the higher.
The radiation would go straight up. We used to derisively refer to that antenna as a cloud burner, but it turns out that's exactly what we need in NVIS work. Here's the juice. A low antenna height is helped by reflection from the Earth. The RF waves go almost straight upward. They bounce back down much closer to your originating station. Thus, it's possible to communicate with, say, within a state where you might not be able to get there on HF any other way. If there are hills, mountains, large cities in between, this is also a big plus. Who thought this stuff up? Well, it turns out back in World War II, the world was absolutely enamored with the Enigma machine. You know, that's the one where they were coding messages, and everybody got all excited when we were able to break the code and steal the machines and that kind of thing. Well, we were all huddled around the Enigma machines, even the mobile Enigma machines. We didn't happen to notice the tubes that were on top of the vehicle that was hauling those things around. And there were other instances of the same thing. Here's another example of World War II German NVIS antenna across the roof of this tracked vehicle. Here's another example of a communications vehicle giving a short range signal. One that the idea is not only a short range signal, by the way, but a signal that the enemy beyond that distance could not hear. And the U.S. military still uses the NVAS concept. We used it at D-Day, we used it in Nam, and we're still using it even today on some of the vehicles. So the question is, can we talk? Are we able? Well, there's more involved to this than just the antenna. There is time of day, frequency. You need to be careful about the highest usable or lowest usable frequency. Not always the muff is what you want. Sometimes it's the opposite. Where we want to reach is a good indicator we have to watch, and what the layers are involved. The one layer that we're concerned with here is the D layer. It's the lowest layer of the ionosphere. The lower the signal frequency, the more D layer attenuation takes place. It can be from 5 to 10 dB for each hop. Now, the D layer is charged by sunlight, and it disappears very quickly without the sunlight. During the daytime, D layer reduces atmospheric noise and reduces the area the transmitted signal can be heard. Now, that's a good thing if you're after NVIS antenna, especially in a military environment where you don't particularly want the enemy further away off of the line to hear what you're saying. So the D layer can be your friend. It can also reduce the noise so that you can hear stations that are closer into you. And another thing that I hadn't thought about, remember that you're aiming a signal. Sunlight fades from the east, so if you're aiming to the east, you want to choose a frequency and a time of day where the sunlight is still covering that area. In case of field day, you might notice that your signal shifts from some portions, say in Ohio, it might shift from Indiana over to Pennsylvania or such. Now, there's a lot of theory involved in NVIS. I'm not the guy to give that to you. You probably already know it anyway. But practically speaking, NVIS is considered anything lower than, say, a quarter wave. So at this case, an NVIS antenna, an 80-meter dipole that's 25 feet high, is still considered well into the NVIS range. But the kind of signal that you want to radiate from it is depicted in this horizontal image here, where you don't want it to shoot out flat. You want it to go up, and it'll cover hopefully within 400 or so miles. Now, if we drop that antenna to 5 feet off the ground, it's not magic. The signal is going to be weaker, and it's going to drop maybe from an S9 to an S7 because the ground absorbs more RF. Conductive ground reflects, poor ground absorbs. So it's not always the best thing to have an antenna that's 5 feet, 10 feet off the ground. Depending on what you're standing on, you might want to have it a little bit higher. The key is the stations you want to reach can hear you. Stations beyond that area, you probably don't care if they hear you or not. So over a reflective ground, you could get a 10 feet antenna, 10 feet off the ground, and it might be equal to a 25-foot dipole somewhere else. You can create a reflective ground as you're putting out NVIS antennas. You can sometimes add a wire, a counterpoise underneath the antenna at ground level. Sometimes we've had guys try putting dipoles over ponds or over bodies of water. Great reflection. So, what have we done? This is short, but I, I don't want to get a textbook kind of thing going here because I'll put myself to sleep. We have now precisely and definitively structured our NVIS antenna theory, right? The concept is a lower antenna radiates straight up, covers hopefully within a 400-mile range. That's usually true, but I can tell you that sometimes it doesn't matter. We had a guy in Zanesville, which is about an hour and a half drive east of Columbus. He had an NVIS antenna up. We were talking to him. Good signal, no problem. About an S5, S6, S7. He went home, put on his regular station dipole, which was up 70 feet, and was 10 over 9. So it's all relative, and we're really kind of picking at straws here because in a lot of cases, a regular antenna is going to work just fine for you. So you kind of have to, see what you have and where you are going to put it. One of the nice things about an NVIS antenna is that it can be very portable. Put it up in a parking lot, put it up over a field, whatever. And when everything is down, flat earth style, that's what you get. And that's when these things actually come up as a great winning antenna. So we found out here that the type of antenna, what style it is, end-fed, dipe, varies your success. The band that you choose varies your success. Time of day that you're on the air with this varies your success. The geography, if you've got flat ground, if you've got mountains, varies your success. Type of soil varies your success. If you put an artificial reflector underneath your antenna, it varies your success. Sometimes it works, sometimes it takes away. And your operating mode, if you're a sideband or if you're working digital or CW, varies your success.
So results may vary.
So go back to that first statement. Never mind. There really isn't a precise way to structure an NVIS theory other than experiment with it, try it out, see what works. But NVIS is a very successful approach to antennas. This is the all else fails banner. Everybody waves the banner when something goes wrong or when we need grants, etc. But more and more, it's getting rare that safety service radios fail. They're just much better hardened than they were when they first started out. The more brittle a system is, the harder it does fall when it does. Something to consider is the system doesn't have to fail to stop functioning properly. I think it was Frederick, I'm not sure, but within the last 4 or 5 years, there was a massive flooding as a result of a hurricane in Houston. Being a retired dispatcher, I was listening to Houston Fire's main channel. They happen to have one of the computer voicing systems where you put the run in the computer, click a button, and the computer itself spits out the address and what's going on. Well, that's fine under normal day-to-day activities, but there were so many requests for service, there were so many runs that the thing never shut up. And the fire engines were telling the fire chiefs, hey, we'll call you on a cell phone, we can't get through on the radio. So they were actually having to circumvent the radio system. Another problem is there were so many runs being given out.
And this is where, if you are a firefighter, EMS, government, military, you can go to AT&T and get on what's called the FirstNet, which is a separate set of towers entirely made specifically for federal government. So if you're on a tower and other people are there, you'll get priority on that tower, And if those towers are down, there are other towers especially made for FirstNet customers. So if you're fire rescue law enforcement, I highly encourage you to go to AT&T and get on FirstNet. By the way, the Verizon Frontline is a lie.
Into areas that were not accessible, medics would turn the run down and they'd pop another run and it'd be into the same area. And the medic would have to come back on the air and say, guys, we can't get there. Stop. So it doesn't have to fail to stop performing. Another more dramatic episode was Michael. I'm telling you, as from the hurricane net, Michael was a very interesting storm. All public systems were down. Radio networks that were able to quickly respond included a lot of HF stuff. Now, I don't know if Carl, I hope Carl's on here. We talked earlier. Carl Martin is the North Florida SEC, K4HBN. If you're there, Carl, unmute yourself and tell us a little bit about what happened down there with the HF, if you would.
You might not be. I can give one story.
Go ahead.
There was a specific county EOC that before Michael really was cool towards amateur radio, and when they activated, they didn't have any hams in the EOC. They had all of their equipment stored in an outbuilding, or most of the equipment, including their satellite radios. The storm hit. They said, oh, we don't need the hams. We'll just go out and get our satellite radios. They went out to look for their satellite radios, and the outbuilding had been blown 4 miles away from them, including what was left of their satellite radios. All of the antennas on the roof of the EOC were also gone. So they were without internet and they were without hams, or without any communication. They had to send out the sheriff to get the hams. And of course, the hams showed up with their own equipment. They had their own antennas and they had their own radios, and they were able to make contact with SARNet, and they were able to make contact with the state EOC, and essentially save the day for that particular county. But so they actually had in the Go kits inverted L's. They were able to set up for amateur HF, and they were able to make contact with the people outside of the county and get them help. It was pretty devastating, and it really opened up the people's eyes up there that, hey, when it does fail, hams can sometimes come in and save the day.
That's true. You're right. My friend James, WX4TV, I believe he was on here a week or 2 or 3 ago. He wound up at a shelter in a county up in the Panhandle and was using a mobile HF radio with a piece of coax that he'd wired as an antenna just to reach the other side of the county, like you said, Barry. And he passed a couple hundred messages in 4 days from the shelter over HF because there was really no other means of communication. In the Panhandle, the SARS stuff was all down, just like everything else. It was just flat. Yep. So, you know, that's not to say VHF wouldn't have worked, because that's fairly flat geography there. But you have to run what you brung. And man, the wire antennas are fairly easy to stick up. I have had a station in the Caribbean call in 105-mile-an-hour wind gusts with her antenna on the ground on 20 meters before. So they work, whether you're looking at NVIS or just regular emergency communications. So this is something to keep in mind. There are other geographic areas, I'm thinking like Alaska, where this is kind of critical. And it's a very effective way to handle that kind of broader distance over a lot of mountains, and line of sight just doesn't really exist. So NVIS antennas, I think this is like the non-learning event of the show here, NVIS antennas are something you need to keep in your toolbox. How many times have we heard that? But it's true. And once you figure out what works for you in your area, it might be several different kind of antennas. Could be long wire, could be inverted V, could be 2259, the military crossed wire antennas. We're going to talk about all of those next week. But you need to be able to do this. And one of the biggest shortcomings isn't so much the antenna anymore as the ability to construct antennas. The first year or two of our NVIS day, a lot of the old guys, the old heads, were busy telling the new hams how to wire an antenna together, how to measure it, how to cut it, how to solder it, how to build it from scratch. And man, I was thrilled to hear that, because that's really, really good stuff. I think Oscar can tell you that a lot of the stuff that went on after the storms involved knowing how to, tie an antenna back up that had gotten knocked over, and find coax that would work and splice things and make them work again. Same kind of thing. If you have the tools, you've got to have the knowledge also in how to construct these antennas and try them out. Once you figure out kind of antennas, like a low altitude inverted V is a good kind of a universal thing. Roll it up, put it in your box, and we give people a chance to try them every year, and that's a cool thing. But NVIS is both overrated a little bit, because a good antenna is a good antenna. But on the other hand, when it's necessary to especially do something portable or in an emergency application, NVIS is really, really your friend. So how do we apply this little bit of NVIS theory that we learned? Well, we already knew it anyway. Cloud burner. And what are the normal antennas, and how well do they work? We're going to talk about that next week, and I will be more than happy to dodge any questions that you might have here. And I'm all about war stories. If you guys have antennas that you've used and they failed, or antennas that you've used and they work, oh man, I want to hear them. I think everybody else would like that too. So we'll let Dan go back and open things up, if you will, and see what you think.
Okay, here I am. Right now I have you spotted, and Stan, I will unspot you so we can see and hear the people asking questions. And should have just happened.
You're spotted now.
Okay. For those that don't know, I think all of you should, but down at the bottom of your screen, right-hand side, it says reactions. When you click on that, it brings up different things you can do. You can raise your hand. That first one to the left side is raise your hand. Well, no, I'm take that back. No, forgive me. It's the one at the very bottom where it says raise hand. When you do that, it will raise a hand. Tim's got his hand raised. And that flag says, well, now he's gone away. He's just playing with it. So you're welcome to put questions in the chat box. Hopefully you put a Q in front of it so we'll know it's a question, or raise your hand. And at this point, we will start taking questions.
Stuff in the chat. There was a comment about using pop-up antenna wires for 60, 70 feet long, up 10 to 12 feet, and or combo antennas with a coil, and trying to get out each hour to check them in a disaster. And Paul said that ice damage here recently destroyed many antenna wires. What can you do to put up in a hurry after a storm? Stan, you want to answer that?
Well, yeah. We kind of had that. We've had that in a couple of blizzard situations. The idea is there was another comment here about portable poles and things. There are a lot of us that are carting around the military mast kits. You don't really need that. My most effective antenna is, take away half of next week's thing, is a 2259. That's an 80 meter and 40 meter dipole inverted V. They're crossed, so 80's going one way, 40's going the other. Common coax feed, and it's only up maybe 15 feet at the center. And I just use garden stakes at the end of the wires to tie them down to the ground. So that's something you can literally carry around in the trunk of a car, and with a portable mast or a couple of those military masts that are just 4 feet each. That'll get you back on the air about as fast as anything I know of.
Okay. Another comment is during the Loma Prieta earthquake, the county EOC in San Jose communicated with Santa Cruz over the hill with an NVIS antenna set on traffic cones. So that's an idea. And the traffic cones are bright yellow, so you can see them, so you can avoid the antenna, which is a good idea.
Yeah, they work great as antenna anchors. Again, if you're running an inverted V, have a little anywhere from 8 to 15 foot pole in the middle. You can tie the ends off to a cone, especially in a parking lot or something, and it's ideal. It's great.
Mm-hmm. I actually saw someone today that was showing off a slinky antenna. It's about 9 feet long when it's stored, but then it stretches out, and they have the bright yellow bungee cords with it. So when you string it up, you can see the antenna. It's a good idea. When you have this stuff, you have to be sure that it's safe and mark it out so people can see that there's an antenna there. Because sure as heck, if you don't, someone's going to trip over it.
Okay, 1 second. We do have 2 hands up. We'll get to you guys in a moment. Go ahead, Barry.
Okay, and let's see if I think we just about had someone check out East Coast amateur radio system on 40 meters daytime to get a good feel for NVIS propagation. Who can hear who? And it's interesting to observe it. And also a state QSO party is a good way to check out your NVIS antennas.
Absolutely, yeah.
Is there a good book on NVIS antennas that you know of?
I personally don't have one. I'm sure there are several.
And because I don't know of a good book on NVIS antennas either, that's why we're doing this video.
Presentation, Understanding H.
I want to introduce Steve Wilson. Steve Wilson is a ham from Marin, but he's going to talk to us about NVIS. He's got like a dozen or more years, and I went up there to watch him put his antenna up a couple weeks ago, and I was impressed with what he does, and I think he's going to tell you a lot. So with that, Steve, take it away.
Just real quickly, I'm Steve. It used to be K0 CNL years ago. I started out in ham radio in 1952. I've been through a couple of the sunspot cycles. And even in the worst of the sunspot cycle over the last couple of years, we were able to maintain HF communication around Marin County, off to Sacramento, down to Thousand Oaks and other places in Southern California and up into Oregon without really any problem. We ran into, in 4 years, we ran into 2 nights that we couldn't communicate on anything. And that was because we had some kind of big blackout going. But NVIS made it through the storm. And we started doing NVIS probably about 20 years ago. And when I was a kid, the only antenna I could put up was about 20 feet tall. And it was a off-center fed dipole for 40 meters. And I worked the whole country with it. And that was nice from Denver because the rest of the country wasn't all that far away. And I was kind of used to that. And then when I moved out here to the coast, you couldn't hear the East Coast anymore. And then I got involved in races again. And what we're mostly interested in is communicating around the neighborhood. We have a county, as you well know, that has Mount Tam right smack in the middle of it. And so in order to talk to each other, we either have to go around it, which we do with just simplex radio nets on the UHF, VHF, or we can go over the mountain using repeaters, or if they quit, then we're in kind of big trouble unless we can do something else. And the west side of Marin has very little cell coverage, and we run about a good dozen or so public service events over there every year. And it's nice to have some kind of communication that we can get pretty much anywhere in the county. And we have a dozen or so hams that have go boxes with antennas that they can go deploy in the field, and usually set up in about 20 minutes to a half an hour and be on the air with batteries and the antenna and everything. And the whole point of NVIS communication is that it's basically straight up and then straight back down again. That's kind of what this logo in the side kind of pretends to indicate. And it stands for Near Vertical Incident Skywave. And that means not quite straight up, because if it goes absolutely straight up, coming right back down to the top of your head, you won't get anything.
Right.
But if you go off a little bit to one side or the other, then you will actually get a signal that will turn around and come back down again. That has some nice advantages, and we'll kind of get into that when we get into propagation. To get the whole thing to work, the first thing you need to do is change your idea about antennas. And an NVIS antenna is counterintuitive. It's low, and it's a simple dipole, and it's made to go straight up instead of out to the side. So we'll get into more of that in a minute. The other thing you have to be aware of, and it's unlike VHF, UHF, walkie world, where it's line of sight, and if you see somebody, you can talk to them. The ionosphere has to help out. It has to be up there and be able to refract your signal and make it come back down again. And part of that ionospheric activity, which is, it's a moving target, is the sunspot activity and the radiation we get from the sun every day. And that's another moving target because it keeps changing all the time. And so what we do here in Marin is we meet every week, and we meet on 3 different bands. And it's to see which one of them will effectively communicate around the county so everyone can hear each other. And it's not the same night to night, week to week. And so everybody's kind of used to the idea of being frequency flexible. And you've probably heard of ALE, automatic link establishment. You run into that? Because that's the thing that the military's kind of adopted now, and it's wide range radios and wide range antennas that can be tuned over, say 2 megahertz to 10 megahertz. And they can kind of go anywhere without rechanging the antenna or retuning or anything like that. And it's to be able to pick some kind of a frequency where you can get the message through. And we do it by mostly going from 160 meters to 60 meters, or to 80 rather, 160 to 80 to 60, and occasionally we can get up to 40 and it actually works. We are now in a new sunspot cycle. It's called cycle 25, and I'll show you another chart a little later. But this is from NOAA. They've been keeping records back to 1750 about how many sunspots there are. Because sunspots are easy to see. Just have a little pinhole and project an image on a piece of paper and you can see the sunspots. Not very well, but you can count them enough. And so they've been keeping records of this stuff, thinking it might have something of use and maybe a portent of something great, like the death of the Queen of England or something. And we're now in a surge that is actually well ahead of schedule. And we'll talk about that in a minute. For an antenna, the kind you need for NVIS is one that radiates straight up, and you get low to the ground, and dipoles tend to be the easiest and best things to do because you can put one up for $5 probably if you have any scrap wire laying around. And one of the little videos at the end of this that you can look at is how to make an antenna out of garbage. You can take an old 25-foot 50-foot extension cord, rip off the outside, take the 2 wires, tie them together, make yourself a dipole in about 10 minutes, and hang it up with a couple of water bottles, and you've got some insulators, and off you go in the field. So you don't have to carry a built antenna with you. You don't have to buy anything either. The other nice thing about it is you can make one whenever you need one, and make it for whatever band you like, because a mono band antenna is actually the most efficient. But there are a couple other kinds of antennas that people are using. One is an in-fed half wave, EFHW. And with that, if you're feeding it from the end of an antenna, you're feeding it at a voltage point instead of the center of the antenna that's a current point. And you need to make a ballot. It's a 49-to-1. It's a 7-turn to 1 turn, or 27-turn to 3-turn ballot. And if you just go on and do a Google search for 49-to-1 un, they'll have about 10 different things in there, show you different ways to make them. You can get them as a kit, you can get them as a bought item from DX Engineering or some of the other companies. But what that'll do is give you a multi-band antenna that you feed from the end. Sometimes that's a little easier to erect than a dipole. Inverted V's also work, and they're nice because you only have to have one pole in the center. You can drope your antenna toward the ground on either end. There's a fancier thing called a terminated T2FD. It's a terminated dipole. Barker and Williams makes them for the military, and it's a folded dipole that has a resistor across from the feed point. It's about a 600 ohm resistor, and it absorbs anything that would be reflected back and become an SWR issue. So you get no SWRs over a really wide range, and that allows for that ALE thing we were talking about. So you kind of go anywhere in any frequency and still talk. Some loop antennas work. They've been using them on military vehicles. I'll show you a slide of one of those in a little bit. And they just more or less squirt things straight up. There's a couple of things about NVIS signals that are kind of useful, and particularly for the military, in that they're radiating straight up, and they don't put out any power off to the sides. So if somebody's tried to DF you and blow you up, they can't find you because there's no energy going off to the sides. And also, if you're in an urban environment, if you're listening, you can't hear your neighbors because you're listening more or less straight up, and the sky waves are coming in, you can hear them fine. But you can reject a whole lot of your neighborhood noise and interference by just having a loop or an NVIS dipole. They both kind of work. What we're after here, the red line is, are you guys familiar with this stuff? You know what these kind of charts mean? This is the radiation pattern of a dipole, the one at the bottom. And you can see that it kind of puts energy out to the sides. That's the red line. And all your energy is going out below 45 degrees or so. And there's nothing, if you look right in the middle where it says minus 30, right down here at the bottom, there's a null here of minus 30 to minus 40 dB, which is a huge amount. And there's absolutely nothing that you can hear going straight up, and there's nothing you can hear, when you're transmitting. You can't put any energy up that way. So with a NVIS dipole, you can get something that's akin to the green line here, in that it takes some of the energy from the sides and lifts it up. It lifts its skirts up on either side so that you don't hear your neighbor's noise, and they don't hear you either. And it's also good for things like TBI, if anybody still has that. But this takes all your energy and squirts it up and off to either side, maybe 15, 20 degrees. And that's the hot zone for NVIS communications. Dipole also has another problem, is that off the ends of the dipole, there's a null. And that's also kind of useful if you can orient your antenna someplace to get rid of some of your neighbor's noises. I have a next door neighbor that has a terrible solar system. And what they're doing is chopping up 600 volts at 9 amps in a square wave, and then converting that back down into AC power. And it puts out harmonics all over the place. It's just a mess. And we had them come out and put filters on it. It dropped it down 20 dB, and they thought that was terrific. It's still an S9 signal all over the bands. So it's not good. So I have a loop that I null them out with, and there's some other tricks too, but that's for another time. But with this kind of dipole antenna, you have to worry about the ends. So you have to orient your antenna in such a direction you can talk to the people you want to talk to. When you go to NVIS, those nulls disappear, and you end up with a pretty much circular antenna pattern that goes straight up, so you can talk to everybody. You can hear everybody. So that's a little more useful. We're talking now about skip zones, and the ionosphere up here, which we'll talk about in just a second, moves up and down every day, but you probably experienced this in your car radio over the years, where you could listen to your local signals at night on AM. Remember AM? Yeah, nobody, right? But at night, all of a sudden, the signals would disappear, and the ionosphere would go up, and all of a sudden, you can hear KSL in Salt Lake or KOA in Denver, some other stations that are way out there. And then at night, after the night was over, they go away again. And that breathing up and down is a daily cycle of the ionosphere. And what happens when you skip off of the ionosphere with a regular antenna, you hop over things in the middle. So you could talk to maybe Colorado, but you would miss everybody in Arizona and Idaho and places like that. And they couldn't hear you at all. You wouldn't know you were there. Then you could, a little later, you could talk to a little further east, maybe Chicago, maybe back to New York, as the time or the frequency changes, because they're interacting in both dimensions. This one we've already seen, but this is a side view of what's happening with the dipole. It squirts its most energy out about under 45 degrees, so usually about 30, 35. And then the NVIS dipole, again, has all its energy going up. You're familiar, I'm sure, with dipoles. This is just a half-wave dipole, quarter wave on either side. And the point here is that it's down low. The ideal height for a 40-meter dipole is about 16 feet. And it's counterintuitive. You think, nah, that's not going to work. And it works terrific. And you raise it up and it gets worse. The other kind of dipole that works is, well, this is a combination of dipoles. This is a thing called the buddy pole. It was developed for use by the military in Vietnam. And it's a thing that can come apart in pieces. And it is a packable kind of antenna. And it has its own built-in guy wires. The 4 guy wires here, 2 of them belong to an 80-meter dipole. The other 2 belong to a 40-meter dipole. And then this is a little matching unit that goes off to the radio. This is a flat top antenna. It used to be called a ZEP, where you have a single wire going up and across the top. That works pretty well. And you have a certain portion of the antenna here that's going to work as a vertical, and you get horizontal, some horizontal juice out of that. And then the rest of it will be vertical antenna, the up and down kind of radiation. So you get a little bit of both, kind of like you do with an inverted V. You get a little bit of NVIS and a little bit of sort of the function of a regular vertical antenna. The military car you see down here below is using a circular antenna. And what that is the old 18-foot whip wrapped around itself a couple of times. And that is quite functional. It's a very narrow bandwidth is the only problem with those kind of antennas. They're only good for about 10 kc and then you have to retune. But they work very nicely. They're low profile. If somebody's trying to find you, you can get under trees pretty well with them and that sort of thing. This is an antenna down at the bottom. I don't know if you can see it, but it looks like a step going along the side of the bottom of the car, like just a little stair to get up there. And that's called a luggage rack antenna. And that's what the ICE people use along the border. And it works quite well. This is a really, sorry about the slide, but this is a type of thing you have to make if you want to use an infed dipole. And if you get on and Google a 49-to-1 balun, it'll show you how to make it. It's got all the parts, the Mauser parts, and all it is a bunch of turns. It's a 7-to-1 ratio, so you can put 1 turn on the first part, but it only handles high frequency. So most of these end up being a little more than this. They end up with 3 turns on the primary with a 100 puff cap across it, and then 27 turns around a T240-30 toroid transformer, toroid disc. Those are about $10 from Mauser or Palomar Engineers, DX Engineering. And you just wind your own. It's pretty easy to do. But if you have 3 turns on the front, you have to kind of match it by having 7 times that on the secondary. And then you can stick it on the end of a long wire and off you go. Okay, this is where, now we're getting into radio propagation a little bit. And NVIS communications work over an area from roughly 300 miles in a circle out to sometimes maybe 500. It gets further than that occasionally, but not terribly reliable, but it is reliable. And it has no skip zones like we were just talking about. It doesn't skip over anybody on the way to get to Colorado, for instance, and everybody can hear you in between. And it's dynamic in that it is affected by sunspots and propagation. And with a lot of hams, they're already using NVIs and they didn't even know it because they have antennas that are less than a quarter wavelength tall, or a half wavelength even. 40-meter dipole, your best height for a horizontal array would be to have it at about 65 feet. And anything less than that, it's going to start folding the edges of that pattern up and making it more and more into a vertical antenna. And we found that you can get these antennas down as about 3 feet off the ground. They still work. We had them on some traffic cones at one of our outdoor events, and we were able to talk just fine to Oregon, Washington, places like that. As you get under about 15, 16 feet, you start losing a little efficiency. So you lose a dB or two for every 5 feet you drop, but it still works. And if you wanted to be sneaky, you could come up with an antenna that nobody could see on your roof, and it worked quite nicely. The dynamic and interactive stuff here really depends on a slight knowledge of astronomy. This is actually kind of fun. Here we have the Earth, good old blue planet, and the sun is shining from our right. And as you can see, it's made the layers here thicker and more dense and closer to the Earth and filling in. If you compare the outer ring here, the F2 layer, to what's happening at night, it's very thin and feeble over here. And during the day, these layers all thicken up, including the dastardly D layer, which is down here closest to the Earth. That's a kind of a bad layer in a way, in that it is counter what we need. With the F2 layer, we're looking at oxygen molecules that are very few and far between, actually. And when the sun shines on them, they get overexcited. When they get overexcited, they have to balance it out by taking on another electron. So they look around for a loose electron and stick them together. And now you have O3 instead of O2. And O3 is ozone. It's a ionized particle at that point. But that last little add-on electron is kind of fragile. And when a radio wave hits that molecule, it can knock that little electron off again. And then that goes and sticks to its neighbor. And then that sticks to its neighbor, and it goes ding, 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 kind of a domino project. And it begins to slow down the process, and it bends the radio signal enough that it come back to Earth. And that's kind of how that stuff works. The D layer, on the other hand, is molecules that are fully formed, and they're more reluctant to give up their little energy layers of electrons floating around the outside. And so what they do is they tend to sop up your signal and eat it. Going up, it hits the E layer, or the F2 layer is what the main one is. And your signal turns around, comes back down, it has to go through that dumb D layer again. And so you get your signal eaten going up and on the return path. Nicely, that when the sun sets, that layer dissipates almost exactly when the sun sets. And so it goes away right after sundown, and it stays gone until morning. So it gets out of the way, and all of a sudden these bands that you couldn't hear anybody on now are blossoming with all these lovely 60 over signals. This is a prettier version of the same thing. These are the F2 layers in the D region. And on one side of the Earth, they're up solid and nice, and the other side they settle down and disappear. The D region isn't even there on the shadow side, as you can see. The E layer doesn't do a whole lot for propagation. It's mostly the F, and there's two layers, there F1 and F2 you hear about. But it's that daily breathing in and out of the ionosphere that keeps changing all the time. Our radio waves that we're doing with NVIs interact with the layers, and they change all the time. Not only that, but the layers are essentially frequency sensitive. So that's a bit of a trick. Where you have a long, low frequency signal, you can get something that'll talk, quite a good ways around the Earth. And this is another example of a kind of a long signal. This would be like 20 meters going all the way to just about the other side of the Earth. And then maybe 40 meters, not quite so long. But if you go too far up in frequency, you'll get a signal that just goes right on through and just keeps on going. You get no skip at all. And what we've been doing lately is using the FT8 frequency. Is everybody familiar with FT8? It's a digital signal. It's on 074, like 14074, for instance. You land on the frequency, it's this hideous screech. But if you get the JS8 software or the FT8 software, you'll realize that there, on that one frequency, there may be 25 simultaneous conversations. It's a wonderful use of the bandwidth, and it's surprisingly good. And so you can get 25 different conversations going on there. Your computer will pick them up and sort them out 20 dB down into the noise, 20 dB down further than you could possibly hear with your ears. So it's really a useful tool for NVI, not only NVIS, but it's also good for disaster services. And that's kind of what we do with most of our digital stuff, is we use FT8 or we've been using JS8 call, because it has a bigger payload and you put more stuff with it. And you can do WinLink with it and that sort of thing. This is, again, the layers we were talking about, and this is a kind of example of what happens at different frequencies. 80 reflects pretty quickly, 60 doesn't reflect quite as quickly, so it goes further. And the angle is changing so that the longer skip is, in this case, 20 meters. Now you could, up in here someplace would be 15 meters and 10 meters, maybe even 6. 6 has actually been active lately. That's just the skywave, different frequencies. We've already seen all that stuff. This is what we're after. Straight up and straight back down again. Not very romantic, but it talks to everybody in your local county or around the Bay Area. The military likes it because if you're trapped in the mountains, you can't hear each other. And that's actually where this got discovered, is that in the World War II, the Germans were in mountainous territory in Switzerland, places like that. And they were communicating just fine to each other, and we couldn't figure out why, because all our trucks had vertical antennas on them, and we were talking to the worms in the adjacent hillsides. Worm warming is what it was called. And this is cloud warming here. When you squirt your signal straight up, it warms the clouds, come down in the next valley, the next one to it, and so on. And so they were able to maintain tactical communications when the Allied forces couldn't do it. And they didn't figure it out until after the war. But if you've ever seen pictures of any of the command vehicles or tanks or things, they have these kind of bars over the top of it. It looks like somebody made like mosquito netting rack. It's kind of what everybody thought it was. It was a rack to hold up canvas or some kind of torn up shreds of cloth that were used as camouflage. So they could hide in the trees with camouflage netting. Nobody could see them. Well, it turned out that was actually the antenna. And it was going straight up and straight back down again. They could all talk to each other. Everybody was happy. And there's a lot of this stuff. I'm not going to go into the complexities of this, but this is on here in case you want to go back and read into it. And this is a part of a Rode and Schwartz tutorial in HF communications. It's excellent. And I've got the link to that at the end of the talk here. This is an attempt to kind of keep up with the NVIS activity. And there's a daily scanning of the entire Earth's atmosphere, and it goes on all the time. And it tells you where you're going to be able to talk, essentially. So if you want to talk here to here, you likely could do it. But you would have to do it on 10 megahertz, for instance. If you wanted to talk from over here to over here, they're both in the purples, so you'd have to drop down to maybe 2 megahertz. And this is a daily and hourly updated thing from a, I guess it's government-sponsored Australian website, and you can tie into it if you want to, just to see what it's like. We've already talked about this. That's the wrong one anyway. But let's look at the sun now and what it does to influence the ionosphere that we have to depend on. And you can't depend on it without knowing what the sun's up to. There's daily and hourly variations. You can sit there and watch the sun in real time now because they have SOHO observatories, solar observatory, and you can sit there and watch it, and all of a sudden, this huge flare will come out. And that's great. You've got 8 minutes to do something, because when a solar flare happens, it creates plasma, and that blows molecules all to pieces. And so the electrons that have no mass can get here in about 8 minutes. It's 93,000 miles, and they can get here. They have the universal speed of light, so they can get here in 8 minutes. The rest of the molecule, the protons, neutrons, come lumbering along at much less than the speed of light. It takes them about 3 days to get here. So we can see the electron hit, pow, in 8 minutes, and we know that something's coming. A lot of these satellite users can turn the satellite around so that the armored end of it's pointing toward the sun for a while. And that protects them. And it gives them a little while to do that, a couple of days, really. And then we know that something's going to happen. The electrons get here and let us know that now we're going to be blasted with something. It could be a coronal mass ejection. That's what a CME is down here. And that's when the sun blows a piece of itself off, and it blows them off anywhere. It could be away from us, off to the left, off to right, up and down. And every once in a while you get one that's kind of aimed right at us, or a little off to the left, which is the east limb, and it's rotating from the left side over to the right. And if you get one that's sort of a quarter way over to the left side, it's going to squirt right at us, because the sun is turning as we watch it every day. It goes around a 21, 27-day cycle. And it's turning, so the ejection that comes off of the sun works like a lawn sprinkler, and it's this long kind of whip-shaped wave that passes out into space. And so it'll start here, and by the time it gets to us, the sun will have moved a little bit, and then we'll get hit by it. And the thing that we watch for is what they call a full coronal mass ejection. And it's when one of these flares goes off, and you see it going off to all sides of the sun in equal amount. If it's off to one side, we know it's going to miss us. But if it's a pure circular halo, then we know we're in for it for a while. And that's when we get all sorts of electromagnetic interference. One way you can keep an eye on the sun, and I don't know if I can move this, is your menu, or is that just mine that's moving around? Can you see that? No? Okay. Well, this is what I want you to see is the top of this slide, and this thing's getting away from moving. But it's solarham.net. It's by VE3EN, and it's a daily net that takes all of the information that's downloaded from all the different sources all over the world and puts them all kind of in one place. So you can see what the sun is up to at a given moment. And right today, we have a solar flux index of 152, and that is not quite the highest we've had in this part of the solar cycle, but it's, I think we went up to 165 one day. During the years of the doldrums, we had no sunspots, almost 2 years of no sunspots at all. The solar flux ended up at about 60, 68 was a real common daily figure for that. And then the sunspot number, which is SSN, that's the number of sunspots that are up there. Kind of a weird way to measure it, but the first is the number of sunspots or groups and the number of sunspots in those groups. But as this goes up, there's a correlation between the output of the sun and the solar flux index. The solar flux index is done by WWV in Boulder, Colorado is one of them. And they take a UHF signal, or actually microwave signal, 1.2 megahertz, squirt straight up and see how high it can go before it has to turn around, come back, or stops. They can't see it anymore. And that gives them an index of the relative density of the ionosphere, if that makes sense. The higher the density, the better the ionosphere is going to work, the better that E layer will be. It'll be fatter and thicker and more able to bounce signals back to the Earth from whence they came. Anyway, those are two real important numbers. The other one is hiding under the little WWV here. And WWV is a radio station, the time and frequency in Boulder, Colorado, or in Hawaii. And you click on that, and it'll give you the K index and the A index. And those are indexes of the geomagnetic field activity of the Earth. So you can kind of keep track of that. That interacts with NVIS communication as well. There's a lot of other things, besides the gorgeous pictures of the sun up here at the top. There's a real nice flare. And this is just around the corner. We have a satellite that is off to the side, trails the Earth around our orbit, and it's off to about 15 degrees or so off to the left. And we can see things before they happen. It's like we have a little mirror there that we can see around the corner and see what's happening on the other side of the sun. And we have some pretty decent, powerful flares out there. The other thing you see down here is this is a sunspot group, and there's another one over here. You all have numbers so you can keep track of them as they go into the other side of the sun. This is an auroral thing that just shows you how big the aurora is around the North Pole. You can also get the South Pole if you want to see that. And there are some people that are aurora hunters who go out and take pictures of beautiful pictures of auroras, and they like that. But a lot of hams that use the auroras to bounce signals off into downtown Europe. So that's interesting to a whole lot of people. And this is another thing that we've been going through lately. This is called a DRAT. And the D layer is that low one I was talking about. And it's an absorbative layer that corresponds to the sun. Now, the sun is kind of off coast now. And so it's beginning, it drags a little bit behind the sun. But as the sun moves across the Earth, this blob of D layer activity starts moving along with it. And we're still not in the clear here. So we're up to about 14 megahertz. It's absorbing some of the signal on 14 megahertz, not too much. It's only about a 5 dB degradation. But if you get down to 160 meters, there's a 30 dB degradation in your signal quality. And that's what this is over here. This shows you at the different frequencies, and this is how much is getting absorbed by that layer. So if we were on 10 meters, we'd be losing at least 5 or 6 dB of signal power. And that's updated every 10 minutes, I think. Pretty quick anyway, but this is a good way to find out what's going on out there and where that D layer is. Sometimes it goes away entirely, and we've had a lot of that, but now that the sun's active again, it's becoming more and more interesting. This is where we are with the new sunspot cycle. A little while ago, we were kind of ahead of schedule, and it's gotten even better. As you can see here, we're up to the solar flux index, which is the first number we were talking about, is well ahead. And this is the number of sunspots, the SSN over here, sunspot number. And it's well ahead of predicted. The red line here is the predicted curve. So it's not even supposed to get good until maybe, 2025, but it's already there. So we've got a really interesting, extra good sunspot cycle coming up. And that's fun to realize. But the bands have opened, the HF bands have opened prematurely, and not a lot of people know about it yet. So the bands aren't crowded, but eventually they will be. We likely for parking in San Francisco. This is a chart that you can get from WWV, and it just explains the geometric A and K indexes. The K index is a 1 to 9. It's a logarithmic, and the A index is just a number up to 400, as high as I've ever seen it. And what that is, it talks about the geomagnetic field getting jumbled up. And when the Earth gets hit by a bunch of radiation of ions, they're pretty powerful and they can affect magnetic field. And so what they do is push the magnetic field out and kind of like a comet's tail, and it'll come bouncing back in, and then it concentrates around the poles. And that's what gives us the auroras. And a lot of people rely on the K and A index to figure out what propagation is going to be on 20 meters, for instance. That's better for DX. It does affect somewhat the NBIS stuff on the lower frequencies. This is a new participant in the field of space weather. Her name is Timothy Skov, and she has a website and a regular weekly broadcast of space weather. And she's kind of fun and entertaining to listen to. And she knows a lot of stuff. And she takes things from all the weather channels and puts it all together into, a human presentation that's really kind of fun. Another place for weather stuff is the Space Weather Center at National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, again in Boulder, and it's got all sorts of things about auroras, coronal mass ejections, magnetospheres, ionospheres, all this sort of stuff. There's a ton of things to discover. This is what we do in Marin County for frequency selection. We usually have 3 bands going, and during the winter, we found that 60 meters didn't work, 40 meters didn't work. The only thing that did work most of the time was 80. And then occasionally we had to go down to 160 meters, and found that was kind of difficult for people, because on a city lot, getting an antenna, a horizontal antenna, to work on 160 is really tough. Vertical antennas are a little easier, but they don't do the same thing. And I've got some friends that are up near the Oregon border, and we can talk back and forth like we're sitting next to each other on 160 meters, but it's been really hard for other people in the county to get an antenna up that shows any sign of promise. Our best band so far has been 80 meters, and during the day we can usually move up to 5405, which is our daytime frequency. And occasionally we've been able to get 40 meters to work, and 7228 is our voice frequency. We have another one there. It's on 7083, and that's for US upper sideband digital JS8 call. And we have a weekly net that we talk back and forth and see how many people we get to sign in on that. That is an excellent thing to have as backup for emergency work, because if you have something like a list of Polish refugees, for instance, or Ukrainians with strange spelling names, trying to get those across verbally would take you the rest of a week. But with being able to type them out and send them, it's huge convenience. That and other things that are complicated names that don't make any sense, like medicine and exact dosages and things like that. If you had to send that, that's really tough to do by voice. So it's nice to have a digital backup. And the winter plan is a little different from the summer plan because the bands are more active. The ionosphere is more thoroughly condensed and thicker and further down. So at nighttime, 160 still works. It's open all day, all night, every time. But there's so much noise that it's becoming less interesting. You have to do some tricks on 160 meters, set up loop antennas, noise canceling arrays, and that sort of thing, and get it to work. But you can do it. Our main frequency again is our 3895. During the day, we can get on 5405. And we usually have to compete with the guys in Sacramento and other places around the country. And there's a bunch of guys up around the Oregon border that talk. And in an emergency, they'd be cool with us taking over the frequency. That's not a problem. But anyway, this is here for you. And if you want to come and join us sometime, please do. And this is a page of links to get you started. And if you've had, I would guess that to be about the average adult dose of NVIS technology for the normal human beings. But if you want to continue, there's a Rode and Schwartz YouTube 20-minute video that goes through pretty much what we've been saying, but a lot more detail. I tried to keep this as simple as I could, so you have a kind of basic overview of what to expect when you start looking at some of these other things. They'll make a lot more sense to you, I should think, now. And that should do it. Listen, now, who do we miss? Do you have any questions? Anybody left? Everybody went to sleep. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I don't have a question, just a comment. I'm glad to see they talk about solar activity, but they're still using the 7-year sunspot cycle, basically.
It's an 11-year cycle.
11 years?
Yeah, from peak to peak, it's 11 years.
Oh, okay.
And we've been through a period of about 3 or 4 years where there were no sunspots, and people were giving up the HF bands for good in some cases, and just thinking it was a bad idea. Nothing would ever work. There was never anybody home. But with that FT8 that I was talking about, you can get people all over the world talking, because they all are on one frequency, which is kind of rare, normal ham radio. But by listening to it, you can not only tell that the band is alive, but you can also tell where the signals are coming from. So you can get a good idea what the footprint is on the other end from where you would be if you get on. And then all you have to do is go down the band a bit to the CW band, call CQ, or go up to the sideband area and start calling CQ there, because you know the band's alive. A lot of people don't know it because it's just sitting there. It's a flat line on your screen if you're watching it. And all of a sudden the signal pops up and it's 20 over 9 and it's, New Mexico or China or, South Africa.
Yeah, I used to use the 2-element beam most of the time and bounced off the ionosphere, and you never knew where in the world you were going to talk to.
That's the fun part of ham radio for DXing anyway. You never know quite what you're going to get. And so
I know, it's fun. That was the fun
always
part.
A surprise. Yeah. I was working on a radio in the middle of the night when I was a kid. The 10-meter band had gone dead. There was nobody around, and I was trying to put an amp together or do something. And I said test 1, 2, and all right, what's going on there, mate? And a guy from Australia came back and sounded like he was in a room with me. Scared me to death. But that was the dead of night on 10 meters.
Yeah. You just go to some empty spot in the band and call CQ and see what happens.
Yeah, it's yeah. Nobody puts a quarter in the jukebox anymore. You can get in there and send out a CQ or two.
Right.
But
Go ahead.
If you get JS8 or FT8, it's JS8X, I think is what it is. It's Joe Taylor's digital mode, FT8. And if you get it, it's got different frequencies for each band that are allocated to that one frequency that they all foregather. And if you get on that frequency, you can tell whether the band is open. So you just set your radio to 10 meters to 15 meters to 20 meters to 40 meters to 80 meters and go punch, 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 punch. And all of a sudden, as you're coming down in frequency, all of a sudden this squawk will break out and you know that's a band that's open. And you go above it and it's quiet. It's not that there's anybody there. Sometimes if you tune onto a band that's absolutely silent as far as you can tell, you listen to the FT8 and all of a sudden a whole bunch of things will start printing out of the noise that you can't even tell there's a signal in there. So it's a pretty remarkable medium. It's part of the whisper thing, though, with the really weak signal propagation.
Because it's funny, you can be sitting there, you pick a spot on the band, and there's nobody there. Well, somebody else in the world is sitting at the same spot and say, gee, there's nobody on.
Yeah.
Until one of you calls CQ and then, ooh.
Oh, there's Janet.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh.
That was more fun.
Yeah,
Malcolm, I see you have a question.
I do. For a while in the Army, I was a Track 80 operator. As a microwave communications with a big antenna. Great. But we used tropospheric scatter. So,
right.
By the way, this is a great presentation. I've loved every minute of it.
Well, thank you.
Because it's microwave, if we aim the antenna, because we could aim the antenna straight.
Da-di-da-di-da-da-di-da. So what antenna do I use? I use a multi-band. It's an 8-band HF antenna. I'll look it up and put it in the chat for you.
Straight up, judging by your slides, that signal would have just gone straight out of Earth's atmosphere entirely.
Yes.
But of the low angle. So do different frequencies bounce off different layers of the atmosphere?
Yes, they definitely do. And they use a microwave to determine the height of the ionosphere. That's that's the WWV sunspot number that they use. And they do it actually a bunch of places around the world, and then they average them together. But it's a way to tell what's happening with the ionosphere. And mostly with microwave and UHF, VHF, they are not very good at being bounced back off the ionosphere because it seldom, if ever, gets to the point where you could actually refract a signal. Once in a while, 60 meters will actually open up, and it's kind of like the miracle band. Oh, it's open, and everybody celebrates. But that's 50 megahertz, and that's kind of a rare event to have the ionosphere be able to support communications, or at least a return of communications on that frequency.
Thanks.
So, Steve, I have a question.
Sure.
So let's say I want to
So this is mine. This is a thing of. You show me yours, I'll show you mine. So here is what I use. They're out of stock right now, but I use the larger of these two antennas. That has this larger transformer in it here. And it is 3 kW version. It is 185 or 180 feet long. Covers 8 bands. So the antenna is not that long. The antenna is 135 feet long. That's what the antenna is. It's 90 on one side and 45 on the other. Yeah, there's something's wrong with that description there because this is the antenna. Let me see if I can find it somewhere else for you.
I want to set up the club to go out and practice this.
Mhm.
And I want to do it at 11 o'clock in the morning, just, without really, maybe do it often. What height, what length and what height should I try? I mean, should it be 40 meters, 80 meters? I mean, where would you start?
Well, that's a tough question to answer with a simple answer, because
Okay.
it's what happens at 6 o'clock in the morning. You're going to have one kind of ionosphere. At 8, it's going to be different. 10, it'll be different. Noon, it'll be different. It'll still be building up in intensity until about 2 or 3 in the afternoon. Then it starts to fade again. And when it gets into a peak of the middle of the day right now, and this is kind of the peak of the summer season, you could probably get 40 meters to work. But barring that, you probably want to go down to 60 meters. And if that doesn't work, then you go down to 80.
So if I would I want to maybe set up an 80-meter, let's see, so a quarter wave for 80 meters, that's about 120 feet?
Yes. What I would recommend, actually, if you want to do that, is to do a multi-purpose dipole by not
Okay.
having it tuned to 80 meters, but tune it something in the middle between 80 and 60, for instance, to
Okay.
about 4.5 megahertz. And then feed the center of the dipole with ladder line that's lossless and have that come down to a tuner, and then feed the tuner with coax.
Okay.
You put the tuner at the base of the antenna. I don't know if you noticed in that one thing where they had the military antenna with the 2 dipoles with the box on the ground. That was a tuner. And what that does is if the antenna is too short, it kind of adds in some of the feed line
Okay.
to make it work. And if it's too long, the stuff, part of the antenna or the wave will go down into the ladder line, the 450 ohm ladder line. And with antennas, the outer ends of the antennas are always a voltage point. You can count on that.
Right.
And then as you go back a quarter of a wavelength, you'll get to a peak of where the current is. And that's what's happening in the middle of a dipole. That's where all the current is. And that's the stuff that actually radiates. The voltage at the end doesn't do anything. It just makes it pull, it helps to pull the current up into the antenna.
So would you go with an end fed first or a center dipole?
I think I'd prefer the center dipole. I've got one that I have about 30 or 40 feet of ladder line on it. And if there's a mismatch, it goes down into the ladder line that's lossless. And if you have it go into coax can't perform at anything other than 52 ohms.
Right.
So you'll get a terrific loss if you have like a 3,000 ohm impedance or something going into coax. It just forget it. Nothing will get out the other end. But if you feed your dipole with a tuner, and then the tuner with coax that goes back to your radio. So between the tuner and the radio, you have a perfect 52 ohm transfer. You'll get all your power that gets out to the tuner, and then it'll take all that power and then try to.
All right, let's do this again. So this is mine. It's 135 foot long right here. And these are the different meter bands. So it'll do the 80, 75, 40, 20, 17, 12, 10, and 6 meters at 3,000 watts. $373. That's the antenna I have. Right there. Because it's 135 feet long. It's 45 feet on one side and 90 feet on the other. So that's what I got. I did not know they made a 270 footer. If I'd have known that, I'd have bought it. And I'd have bought it. I'd have bought it up here at the 3,000 watt. But where the studio is, I didn't have enough room for that. So maybe one of these days, if I'm rich and famous, I'll get one of those. But right now, all I've got is this. Right here, this exact one. 3,000 watt, 135 foot. And in the chat is that. Longer is always better. Yeah, if you got the room, do the 250. I didn't even know they made a 250. I probably wouldn't have bought the 250 because I don't have the room for that where the studio is. But more is better, especially when it comes to antenna.
Put it all into the antenna from there.
So it would be dipole, ladder line, tuner to the radio.
Yeah, exactly.
With coax.
Yeah, that's one you can try all three bands with.
Okay.
You can get an 80, 60, or 40, and you can tune it up to 15 meters and 20 meters if you want to. You end up with a pattern that has multiple lobes on it, but it still works.
Okay. But is it sufficiently efficient?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. As long as you're not getting a huge mismatch in the coax itself.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what that in-fed thing is about. What it's trying to do is take 52 ohms and match it to probably a 4,000 ohm load that you would get on the end of a dial.
Hello, Huggies Worldwide.
I love this guy. Here's a link to his channel.
I am in the process of updating the general class videos. And this is the manual from 8 years ago. And this is the manual today. The videos are 8 years old. As it turns out, the old syllabus covered NVIS, and the new syllabus does not. So that meant that I had to take a section on NVIS out of one of the instructional videos. And I looked at that section and went, that's actually a pretty cool section. So here it is, NVIS, Near Vertical Incidence, Skywave Propagation, just for you.
The first one we're going to start with is NVIS, which stands for Near Vertical Incidence Skywave Propagation, and that is a mouthful. And people were using it for a long time, but the term actually became popular because of a series of QST articles like this one from the May 2005 issue, which talks about NVIS. So let's take a look at that one first. Let's see how it works, and then I think you're going to find that if you put up any HF antenna at all that's horizontally polarized, you're already set. Now, I just want to talk a little bit about what NVIS stands for. And if you look at the Earth, I've got a little bit of curvature of the Earth, and I'm going to put your ham shack right here. Okay, and you've got an antenna that's horizontally polarized. Here's your feed line coming in. Okay, now I'm going to skip ahead a little bit to talk about the ionosphere, which was a study rather more thoroughly in an upcoming lesson real quick. It's enough to say that the sun ionizes a layer of the atmosphere up above here. The ionosphere is way, 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 way high in the atmosphere, and it's kind of what the sun's radiation hits. And it causes the electrons to separate from some of the atoms of the oxygen and nitrogen and stuff that are up here, and leaving these electrons free to run wild. So what happens is, if you send a signal out from your antenna and it happens to go straight up, it's going to hit this vertically and it's going to come right straight back down at you. In other words, the ionosphere acts as a reflector. Okay, now this is the vertical. So in our NVIS, the vertical means,
and I know this guy is a teacher, but I need to correct him. It does not act as a reflector, it acts as a refractor. A reflector is more, how should we say, precision in its reflection, as in like a mirror. And this is more like crumpled aluminum foil, and reflecting light back off of it, it scatters it some. It disperses it. It's not a clear reflection, which is what you would get from a reflector.
Straight up. Now, incidence means the angle at which it hits the ionosphere. Now, this doesn't do you much good unless you want to talk to yourself, but if you've got a buddy over here, okay, your signal, of course, goes in all directions, but it would come down like this to your buddy. Okay, now this angle right in here, obviously this isn't vertical, but we call this near vertical, okay? Near vertical and incidence, that's the angle at which it hits at near vertical incidence, and it's called skywave propagation because this guy is not hearing from you directly. He's not hearing from you directly. He's hearing you via the skip from the ionosphere, which is what we call the skywave. So your antenna must be horizontally polarized for this to work, and in order for it to radiate pretty much straight up, it has to be pretty low to the ground. Most 80-meter dipoles are pretty low to the ground, so most 80-meter dipoles will work pretty well with NVIS. And that's really all there is to all this vertical near stuff. I point out that if you put up a proper 80-meter dipole, it should be a half wavelength in the air. Well, half of 80 is 40, and that's like 120, 130 feet. And if you've got the way to get an antenna 130 feet in the air on both ends, great, go for it. But most of us have to put the antennas much closer to the ground. Maybe we can get 20 or 30 feet in the air. Well, as it turns out, what have we done? We've constructed a perfect NVIS antenna. So there's a very good chance that if you have a horizontal dipole and you're on 80, you're all set for NVIS. For this to work, your signal frequency has to be below something called the maximum usable frequency, or MUF. Now, this usually means 80 meters, sometimes 40 meters. Now, there's a website you can go to see what the MUF is in real time. And it's right here, www.spacew.com/www/fof2.html. And I'll put that link up on the website. Now, let's take a look at the map that shows up in here. Now, it's mid-afternoon when I'm doing this, so the MUF's a little bit higher. Now, you've got to understand how these lines work. This is 13 megahertz, 12, 11, 10, 9. So where we are right here in southwestern Colorado, the current MUF for NVIS would be somewhere between 8 and 9. So 7 megahertz would probably work pretty well. Now, this varies a lot during the day, and as you can see, this was 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. So if you're in the United Kingdom right now, 3.975 megahertz would probably work for NVIS. Now, what happens if your frequency is above the maximum usable frequency? Well, it just isn't reflected by the ionosphere. It goes straight up through it into outer space and becomes part of the noise of the cosmos.
You put it straight out level, it doesn't matter the direction because you're reflecting off of the atmosphere. You just need to wire flat and level about 20 feet off the ground, the entire length. So don't worry about which way it's pointing. That was in the previous class. I guess you missed that.
Hi, I'm Michael, KB9VBR, your host for Ham Radio Q&A. I'm on a mission to inspire and educate the amateur radio community. So if this is your first time watching, Thanks for tuning in, and be sure to hit that subscribe button. Well, today we're going to talk about NVIS, or Near Vertical Incident Skywave Propagation. NVIS antennas are loosely defined as an antenna that is mounted at a very low height to give you a greater amount of local or regional communications. Basically, NVIS antennas are used in the HF bands, primarily the 75 and 40 meter bands, and should give you a range of about 100 to 300 miles. The low antenna height of an NVIS antenna works by eliminating or reducing ground wave or skip propagations, and enhancing the skywave propagations, where more of your RF energy is going straight up and then reflected straight down from the ionosphere. So basically what you're doing with an NVIS style antenna is, instead of sending your signal outwards, you're sending it up to focus more of that energy in the local or regional area you wish to communicate with. So why do we need one? What's the importance of an NVIS, or Near Vertical Incident Skywave antenna? Because if we wanted to contact or communicate locally, wouldn't VHF work well for us? Well, VHF and repeaters are great for short range or very local communications, but when you want to extend your distance out to a more regional level, say 100 to 300 miles, you're going to start to really run into problems with the higher frequencies with such as VHF or UHF. So the importance of NVIS and HF communications for regional work is basically, you've got no reliance on infrastructure. You can have a totally self-contained unit or station on battery power, and you don't need any infrastructure such as links, nodes, repeaters to communicate. Next up, you're going to have greater range than you will with VHF. Using the 75 or 40 meter band, like I said, you can reach out 100 to 300 miles or so, and since you're and within that 300-mile bubble, almost all of the stations, if they're all using NVIS antennas, should be able to communicate with each other. And then third most important reason is terrain is really not an issue. When you get up into VHF, UHF communication, your line of sight and terrain can make a big deal. If you're in a valley and need to get over a hill, it's not going to work, especially if you're not connected to a repeater or some other type of link. Point-to-point communications between mountain ranges, hills, or rugged terrain isn't the answer. But with NVIS, hills almost melt away. You're sending a signal straight up, it's coming straight down, it's going to go over those mountain ranges, it's going to extend through valleys, so terrain is no longer an object. So, how does NVIS work? Well, basically, you take a half-wave dipole antenna and then mount its peak at a very low height. When you're looking for DX, you're going to want to mount your peak of the antenna up a quarter wave, a half wave, or so, to really enhance that skip. But with NVIS, since we want the signal to go upwards, we want to keep the antenna height very low, say 12 to 15 feet. You don't need to be any higher than 15 feet for a good NVIS antenna. NVIS works best for the low bands, so 40, 60, 80 meters are going to be your primary choices for NVIS communications. And some people say using a ground wire running parallel to your dipole also enhances the NVIS properties. I haven't really experimented with that, and online I've seen both pros and cons of doing it that way. So that might be an option too, to run a ground wire parallel to your low radiator for the NVIS properties. So what I'm using for my NVIS antenna is a half-wave 40-meter dipole antenna. It is approximately 66 feet long, which gives, which is about 35 feet per quarter wave leg. It fits perfectly. I'm out here camping this weekend. It fits perfectly in our campsite. I got a 12-foot fiberglass painter's pole that I'm using to support the center, and then each end is tied off at about a tree at about 7 feet of height. So, you know, it works great for the local communications. In fact, maybe what we'll do is I'm just going to cut away to a little demonstration on NVIS communications here, so you can kind of hear how the NVIS antenna is working.
KD9CJX, KD9CJX, KB9VBR.
KB9VBR, KD9CJX, you're still about 5757.
Roger, roger. You're coming in at about 5758. Location here is I'm down near Wisconsin Dells at the corner of Columbia, Sauk, Juneau, and Adams County. So where are you located?
We are back in the middle of Burnett County in the northwestern corner of the state. Probably about 20 miles from the state line and about 15 miles from the St. Croix. Over.
Roger that, roger that. So distance-wise, we are probably talking, I think it's about in the neighborhood of 180, 200 miles by the crow flies. I've got a 40-meter dipole antenna. It's in an NVIS configuration. The peak is about 12 feet, and each of the legs is tied off on 2 trees at about a 7-foot height.
Roger that. We're running about the same. The 40-meter dipole at about 15 feet and running it at flat top.
Okay, good deal, good deal. Yeah, one thing I heard about NVIS antennas is they work best if all of the parties are running NVIS. But it's, like I said, you know, super strong between the two of us. So it's good to hear making a solid connection across the state.
Roger that. It's looking good to be able to do this for emergency communication. It only took me about 15-20 minutes to get the antenna up in the air, so it's pretty good setup the way it is, and you get across the state without any traffic.
Yeah, roger that. That's true. Because it's the 40-meter antenna is only about 38 feet on a leg. It's not unwieldy to get set up. It can, you know, fit into most spaces compact, and I was able to use a tuner to get it down to 75 meters. So it makes an excellent 75 meter NVIS antenna too.
Hello and welcome to Military HF Radio. This is the series introduction. I'm your host, Matthew Sherburne, KF4WZB. In this series, I'm going to show you the episode pipeline. Here, starting off with RF theory, where we'll be talking about all the basics of radio frequency communications. Next episode will be on military HF history, going all the way back to World War I, all the way to the present. The next lesson, which I think is one of the most important, HF near vertical incident skywave propagation lesson. We'll talk all about NVIS and how you're able to implement it. Followed by our 4th episode on VOACAP analysis. I'll take you through the website that shows you how to input your information and the information of the distant end station so that you can come up with the best frequencies that you need to communicate with. Then the 5th episode will be on HF antennas. We're going to talk about everything. Everything from dipole antennas, vertical whip antennas, the best way to orient them to help with NIVIS propagation, and also for communicating long distances past 500 miles. Our 6th episode is going to be on 2nd generation and 3rd generation automatic link establishment. ALE used heavily within the U.S. Army Mars community and also in the military. Our 7th episode is going to talk about digital communications and how to best utilize those digital communications techniques and also the technology behind it. Our 8th episode is going to talk specifically on U.S. Army Mars, or the Military Auxiliary Radio System. And then finally, the 9th episode is going to wrap up with lessons from the field, talking to you about a couple of anecdotal evidence behind some of the core concepts we've talked about through episodes 1 through 8, and hopefully give you some more context to issues that can happen out there and just some personal stories from that. And then finally, why high frequency radio? We're dominated by SATCOM, or satellite communications, and it costs lots and lots of money. HF can be an excellent primary, alternate, contingency, or emergency part of your communications plan. And that's either for both low data rate and voice communications. And throughout the episodes, we'll talk about why the digital communications is low data and not the type of bandwidth that satellite communications can push. And that's one thing, though, that HF cannot replace, is the sheer amount of bandwidth that satellite communications provides us. But in the absence of satellite communications, we can still push data. We can use HF in mobile operations. You can attach a specific type of antenna to your vehicles in order to communicate on the move. The biggest thing, though, is there's no infrastructure needed. I mean, outside of needing to attach equipment to vehicles or antennas or the massive HF stations that might be out there, there is no satellites in the sky. And so that is the one key thing behind this all, that if all the satellites go away, we can still communicate. And that's what just makes HF so powerful. It is what was used World War I, World War II, Korean War, Vietnam, and onwards, and it's still relevant today. So I hope that you stay with me as we talk at our next episode on RF theory. Thank you. Create a Wave is the radio frequency energy that you're Welcome to Military HF Radio, Episode 1, Radio Frequency Theory. I'm your host, Matthew Sherburne, KF4WZB. We have 9 episodes to cover, so today we'll be covering Episode 1. Each episode is going to touch base with the previous episode and build upon previous concepts. So make sure to like and subscribe so that you can keep continuing your education into Military HF Radio. The agenda for today: the Federal Communications Commission Amateur Radio Licensure, Army Doctrine and Training Overview, Radio Communications, Wave Propagation, Propagation Paths, and then finally, Solar Activity Effects on Communications. So, FCC Amateur Radio Licensing, why? We all need to be technical leaders in our organizations, whether it's being a soldier, NCO, or officer. Getting your amateur radio license allows you to apply your radio skills in what is, some people see it as a hobby, but it's also a professional organization. It's outside of the military. It's a place where you can just grow and learn with others. You become a member of a worldwide professional organization. The Amateur Radio Relay League is the National Association for the United States. Other countries have amateur radio in their own versions of the Amateur Radio Relay League. All of that knowledge that you're getting in your professional military courses in radio, you can now test and validate. The FCC charters amateur radio to do a number of tasks, but one of those is to advance the art and science of radio communications. The amateur radio license is to a 25 uniform, which in the U.S. Army, the military occupational specialty of radio telephone operator, that is to getting your Net Plus or Security Plus for 25 Bravo, which is our automations soldiers. So, testing classes are offered closer to you than you think, and you can find a class or an exam by looking at either of those two URLs. There are numerous amateur radio clubs hosting classes and exams near military bases, or if you're a National Guardsman or reservist, that during your day job you're not really near an actual base, they're everywhere. So please give that a look. Now, finally, U.S. Army Doctrine and Training. Every service has their own versions of their doctrine for HF radio and tactical radio operations, but here I'm just going to talk about your day.
Hello guys, Oscar Hotel 8, Sierra Tango November here from Survival Tech Nord. Today we're talking about messaging in JS8 Call. Now although it might not be completely apparent, JS8 Call has a variety of messaging functionalities to ensure your message gets through to the receiving station. This functionality is also completely independent from the normal keyboard-to-keyboard QSO you're used to. In fact, I think it would be safe to say these messaging functionalities will be extremely useful in emergency communications, communications for preparedness, and group communications where reliability is critical. So, stick with me, and I'll tell you all about it.
You are listening to the Emergency Broadcast Systems. This station broadcasts emergency news and official information on the air for assigned area.
Now, in addition to JS8 call messaging, this video also covers, in brief, NVIS on 80 meters for reliable communications. And just for the sake of discussion, all three stations were located in KP25. Station configuration was the Chameleon MCOM 3B, 3 meters off the ground in horizontal configuration. I was also using JS8 Call version 1.01 and the Yaesu FT891 at 25 watts. Now before we get started with the messaging examples, I'll show you a test we did at 5 watts, 10 watts, and 25 watts using an NVIS antenna and JS8 Call on 80 meters. When we're looking at JS8 Call, or any digital mode actually, as a tool for grid down or off-grid communications in an emergency communications scenario, we need to find the absolute balance between using the least amount of power necessary versus effective and reliable communications. So in this example, you can see that JS8 Call is slow, but it's very effective. Using a very modest antenna configuration, we were able to maintain reliable and effective communications for nearly a day and a half, without any intermediate infrastructure. Low power, the right antenna, and the right digital mode. This may not be the recipe for traditional emergency communications, but it definitely is an effective and reliable unorthodox emergency communications method. Because of these low power requirements, we can use rigs like the 817, the KX2, the KX3, the MCHF, or many of these Chinese micro HF radios to get more people on HF and the JS8 Call network for emergency communications. So now let's move on to a few of the different types of messaging examples we have in JS8 Call. In this first example, I'm just going to tell the guys what I'm going to do, then follow that up with a few different messaging examples. As we're talking about reliable communications with JS8 Call, one of the tools we have in JS8 Call is the message acknowledgement. The acknowledgement is like a reception report, simply letting us know that the receiving station has received that message. In the rest of the video, please look out for the message acknowledgements after my transmissions. In this first example, we'll send a direct message from my station to Oscar Hotel 8, Echo Foxtrot, India. So now we sent that message off, and all we have to do is wait for an acknowledgement. And there we have it. Let's go ahead and move on to the next message example. So now we're going to send a relayed message. We're going to send that message to Oscar Hotel 8 Echo Fox India, requesting his station to forward that message back to me. Now, in order to do this, we're going to type Oscar Hotel 8 Echo Fox India into the message box, then follow that with the forward symbol. Next, we'll add the call sign to the station we want to forward our message to, then add the MSG or message designation after the call sign. After that, we enter our message and fire it off. The message formatting will be edited automatically for you, and the checksum will be added to the end of the message.
to wait till, okay. Like I was saying, is this presentation is NIVIS, Near Vertical Incident Skywave. Like I said, I do have one on display out here. It's a little fancy, but I was doing some more homework today. And you'll see that one out there is strung out rather taut and straight. I found out today you don't even need to do that. The guy showed, he literally just threw the antenna on the ground. It looked like a snake on both ends of the banana clip, and it worked without a reflector or anything. Now I've got a reflector on there. I'll touch on that in the presentation, the reasoning behind it.
On this episode, I am discussing NVIS, or Near Vertical Incident Skywave Propagation, and a training item on establishing your family emergency communication and reunification plan. This is the Field Radio Podcast. I'm your host, John Jacobs, W7DBO, Whiskey 7, Delta Bravo Oscar. Thank you for clicking and tuning in and joining us on this podcast. In the way of news, I got the honor to be on the Ham Radio Now show last week with David Goldenberg. David has been on the show twice discussing field portable operations and emergency communication support. On his show, we discussed the building of Go Boxes, the Field Radio Podcast, and took off in several other directions discussing all things ham related. I will link in the show notes of the video that is on YouTube, and the audio is also posted in podcast format. The clock is ticking and 4 weeks to go until Dayton Hamvention in Xenia, Ohio. I'm excited to get back there and this year be free to move around and capture as much as I can and bring it back to you. The Dayton Committee announced a product showcase for the media where vendors have a few minutes to demonstrate new product lineups. Each one of these will be recorded for YouTube and also published in audio-only format. The plan is my father, Larry, W7ZBO, and I will fly out Wednesday and be on the ground all day Thursday for setup through Saturday. As far as scheduling goes, there will be one more podcast release before Dayton. Then the week of Dayton, there will be nightly wrap-up shows Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. Then the following week or so, all the other video files will be released. If you would like to support the Dayton broadcast, there will be more information on the website at fieldradiopodcast.org. The topic of this show this week is NVIS. I have been working the past month on some field experiments with NVIS and wanted to go into depth on this episode. There is no guest for this topic, so I'll break down NVIS and practical applications of this theory. I hope you enjoy. In conversations, you will hear reference to a NVIS antenna when actually NVIS is a propagation mode that can be leveraged with almost any type of antenna. NVIS, spelled phonetically, November, Victor, India, Sierra, stands for Near Vertical Incident Skywave. NVIS is a propagation mode which uses high-angle radiation to send your signals almost straight up into the air.
Head down, moving in. Well, we've got birds in the sky. We now have visual on target. Okay, standing by for your instructions. Target locked and ready. Roger.
Disengage. Waving up.
We have hospitals moving in. Roger, prepare for getting into position, sir. Permission granted.
1.
To be reflected back to Earth. An easy, simplistic way to think about this is the effect when you spray water out of a hose straight up in the air. The water forms an umbrella of water and comes back down in a circular pattern. Typical transmission power is upwards to 100 watts and 50 watts for digital modes, as you would expect with typical operation. Depending on the band conditions, the D layer in the day can eat up a bunch of the signal, and an amplifier may be needed to break through the noise during the day. Now compare NVIS to long path propagation that you would typically use when you desire DX or distance contacts. You configure your antenna to have as low takeoff angle as possible to get the right bounce off the ionosphere to achieve around-the-world contacts. This type of setup will produce what is called the skip zone. This skip zone is between your longest ground path and your shortest skywave distance. So this is where NVIS propagation has value. You can make contact more easily with the stations in this skip zone. This is beneficial in emergency communications because you desire to make a contact with a close city, possibly an EOC, and not logging that rare DX contact in the South Pacific. The military has long used NVIS for short and medium range contacts in the field. For emergency communications or EMCOM, the NVIS is beneficial also because the setup is fairly easy, can be done by one person, and only requires a 16-foot mast. The only downside is you will need a 45-foot by 45-foot space to set up this antenna, but that can be easily overcome in the grass area of a park or a clearing in the field. So let's take a look more at the specifics of frequency and propagation. NVIS only works from the 2 MHz to 10 MHz band, depending on band conditions and time of day. The concept is that the signal will penetrate the D layer of the ionosphere and bounce off the F layer. The reason for the 2 MHz to 10 MHz range is anything lower than 2 MHz will not penetrate the D layer, and anything higher in frequency will not bounce off the F layer but penetrate into space due to the high takeoff angle. So for amateur radio operation, we are looking at the 40, 60, 75, and 80 meter bands. Below 10 megahertz, you can make reliable communications at the range of 600 miles or less. Since we are using the 40 through 80 band, a properly configured dipole can provide effective communications 24 hours a day, utilizing 40 meter band during the day and 80 meter band during the night. The reason for moving down the dial through the night is with the weakening of the F layer at night, the 40 meter signal that worked during the day now penetrates into space instead of being reflected back down to Earth. The ideal antenna for NVIS is a dipole low to the ground. Now, a dipole at a half wavelength above the ground exhibits directionality and low takeoff angle, which is desired for DX. However, if you take that same dipole and position a quarter of the wavelength above the ground to 1/10 of the wavelength above the ground, you get not only the high takeoff angle needed for NVIS, but also an omnidirectional pattern which is desired for this mode of operation. Now, because the wire is now so close to the ground, that same dipole that was up high in the air will now need to be tuned as well due to the ground effect on the antenna. So you'll need to shorten up your lines a bit to get back into a resonant frequency. There is some debate on the best configuration of the dipole. Some will say that a flat top horizontal dipole produces best results, where the ends and middle are all at a quarter wavelength or less above the ground. Others, like me, believe that a slightly inverted V configuration is best. I think half the reason why I believe the slight inverted V produces the best results is it is more field expedient to set up and requires less gear. Several years ago, I decided to finally make my own dipole configured for NVIS. DX Engineering has a great document that I have sourced for this episode. They also have all the information and parts needed to build your own antenna. I like the configuration they have with essentially a pole in the middle raising 15 feet high and the 40 meter dipole extending one direction and the 80 meter dipole extending 90 degrees off of the 40. So if you can picture it, especially here on Audioland, you will have 4 wires extending away in an X pattern if you're looking down on the configuration. 2 wires for the 40 meter and 2 wires for the 80 meter. Now this setup also makes life easy because now you essentially have 4 guy wires holding up your mast. So no other guying is needed. And since you are only 15 feet off the ground, there is very little risk of putting this up in a park or a field as long as you have the space for the wires. Now for the center mass, I used 4 4-foot military-type canvas poles. These come in fiberglass or metal and is sold at surplus stores as camouflage netting poles, but we as hams know they're better known as portable antenna masts. We don't tell them that or they would triple the cost at the store. Sometimes they sell them with fiberglass ring used to spread the camouflage netting at the top. However, if you turn the whole pole system upside down, this top piece now becomes a nice bottom piece to keep the mast from sinking into the ground if you are in loose sand. Typically for higher masts, I will use metal poles, then switch to fiberglass 2 sections before the top of the mast. However, since there is little to no load on the mast, all fiberglass works great for this setup. Now 4 of these poles put you at 16 feet. So I just put my plastic center tee that connects the wires to the coax a foot down on one of the poles using some pipe clamps. You can also drill some bolts through the mast to secure the T-point. You can make your tee on a 3D printer or use common PVC pipe, or DX Engineering has a nice one I used. In the instructions I will include in the show notes, DX will give you a bill of materials you can order from them minus the mast to assemble your own. So getting back to the build, for 40 meter side you will need 2 25-foot sections of wire, then attached to the ends of the wire, a rope 20 foot long. On the 80 meter side you will need 2 wires at 38 feet with an attached
All right, Mr. CT, if you're ready to go, let's get you up.
Okay, thanks, Bruce. And sorry for falling out of the Zoom teleconference where you're giving me all the good rev up there at the beginning of the meeting. For some reason, 2 sessions of PowerPoint started up. And when that happens on this computer anyway, that prevents me from changing slides. So we didn't want that. So let's try to share the screen here and see how this works.
Bill, you need to change your name there.
What is my name?
It's Patrick Goodman.
Oh my goodness. Oh, well, I'd rather proceed with that's what I get for logging in with your account there the other time. Please indulge me that. I'd rather get started here. Let's see. Everybody see the screen share?
You're up. You're good.
Excellent. Thank you. Bill K1CT presenting. Yes, I'm not Patrick Goodman. Goodman, but thank you, Patrick, for allowing us to use your account there for the Convair 220 Club meetings, which we just held on Thursday. And that's what's happened. The Zoom teleconference app has remembered Patrick's identity rather than mine. But we'll see what we can do about that. So we're going to talk about NVIS, Near Vertical Incident Skywave Operations. This was requested by one of our members. I don't remember who, but Rob does, because he asked me to put this presentation on, as he was indicating before, getting the local talent in here too.
It's my big pleasure to introduce our first speaker. It's Professor Colonel Stephen Hamilton, KJ5HY, Chief of Staff and Technical Director of the Army Cyber Institute, Professor at the United States Military Academy at West Point, and we're so happy to have Colonel Hamilton here. His title of his talk is The HF Resonance in the U.S. Army. It's all yours, Colonel Hamilton, and we love your uniform.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Jim. It's quite an honor to be here amidst some real giants in the field. It's kind of humbling to me. And when I talk about giants, I'm actually just talking about the towers at Tim's house and Frank's house. I don't know if anybody's driven by there or seen them on Google Maps, but they got some impressive setups. No, but in all seriousness, this is it's really an honor. It's a wonderful program that you put together, Jim, and I'm excited to talk about this topic mainly because I joined the Army. I graduated from West Point in 1998, and I was a ham operator in high school and middle school, and when I decided on what branch I wanted to go, there's this branch called Signal Corps back in the day, and so I as a computer science major, I had various officers tell me various things about how to choose a branch and what's important. But I think what drew me to Signal was because at one point someone said, if you really like communications, then you want to do that. And so I thought about it, and I was like, I already know Morse code, because back in the day you had to learn Morse code for your general class license, and so I thought, I'll just do that, and then I'll already be a leg up when I get there. And oddly enough, the Army equipment, as you'll see in my presentation, is it's kind of what I'll use the term soldier proof is what we use, which is basically it's you don't put a lot of thought into the radio side. You just turn it on and you make it work based on the instructions you're given. So I remember at one of the first exercises, they were saying that they were having trouble, and I said, I was like, what's the SWR on your antenna? And they looked at me like I had a third eye or something. They were just like totally confused. And it's ironic now that all of the things that kind of went away with HF when I was just starting out in the Army are starting to come back. And that's what my talk is about today. High frequency renaissance in the United States Army. So with that, I think is my screen. I think it's sharing. Let's see. Yeah. Okay.
Yes, it's sharing.
Okay, perfect. All right, so I don't know. It would have been great to have done this in person, but I don't know there's probably varying levels of what people know about HF in the audience.
Okay, and the best part about this video so far is right here. This is a PSC5 radio. I worked on this antenna, this radio, and the manual for this and the training for this radio. That's fucking cool. I love it.
I'm sure that there's plenty of people here that know way more about it than I do. As Jim said, I'm a computer science professor in the electrical engineering computer science department, and that's my training. So a lot of people in the department keep thinking that I'm an electrical engineer, and it's because usually electrical engineers are the ones that are the experts.
Well, Blackwater, I need a bunch more people like you, buddy, to make this to work all over the United States. We need a bunch more people, so grab your friends. It goes for all of you. What I thought we were going to have, 5 more years, 10 more years to do, we'll be lucky if we get 5 to 10 more months to do at the rate what we got going on now. So there is no more time to fuck around.
Experts in the RF field. So why am I talking about it? It's mainly because of what we were discussing just before this program started. I started out as Signal, but I switched over to Cyber, and the new Cyber branch stood up just a few years ago. And as a computer scientist and as a Signal officer, Cyber seemed to be a natural fit to kind of slide into. And I'm at the Army Cyber Institute. And we're thinking about like future problems, and over the last 20 years we have been relying in the Army so much on satellite for everything, and we've been fighting an adversary that doesn't really have much capability to jam our satellites, doesn't even understand it. But if we look at a future threat of our what we call near peer adversaries, China and Russia, they have capabilities. They have electronic warfare capabilities, and knocking out a satellite, either as we just saw with Russia shooting them down physically, or with using electronic warfare means, jamming is really not that difficult, because there's really not a lot of power. If you think about a satellite trying to transmit back down, it only has so much power it can transmit, and so the signal that comes back is fairly weak. So it's not hard to knock someone off. So the question becomes, what did the Army do before satellite comms? And we did HF. That's what we did, and it was slightly before my time. I think I did learn a little bit about HF when I first joined the Army, but it was kind of not. After 9/11, everything, we focused on counterterrorism, and everything kind of changed after that. So thinking about long haul comms, and I'll use the term beyond the line of sight. That's really what we're talking about here. There's only, without a satellite, there's really only one way to do it. We could debate over troposcatter, which is another method of going beyond the line of sight, but it requires a lot of power. But basically, HF is what we used prior to that. So what is HF? Just a quick background. I know plenty of you have probably seen this chart and understand it, but as I look at this, I'd like to just point out that there's just, the electromagnetic spectrum has some special properties depending on where you're at in it. So if you look in the center, you see center left, you see visible light. So that part of the electromagnetic spectrum is super critical for us to see. It's what we see around us. It's the light that we see. If you go to the right, you see where HF is, and HF is this only part of the spectrum that has this weird property that Marconi was not quite understanding and trying to figure out, was the idea that it bounces off the ionosphere. So that unique property is what allows us to do this beyond the line of sight communication. So this is another, I like pictures, so this helps kind of just describe. The ionosphere is way up there, F1, F2 layer, and between 3 and 30 megahertz, when you transmit, you can get it to refract back down, which can take you over a mountaintop or over a building or a town, depending on what your location is. And so this property is really the critical piece, because it's not like a satellite that you can jam. It's the ionosphere. It's a property of our atmosphere. So a quick history here on HF radio. So some of you are hams and see your normal Kenwoods and ICOMs, and I think that it looked like there was a giveaway for an ICOM at the beginning here they're talking about. So those radios, I love, as a ham operator, I love operating those radios. But when I pick up one of these, I always get immediately frustrated, because they're very confining. You don't just kind of surf around the band and try to find a frequency and then listen for a contest station or something like that. These radios are what I would call soldier proof, as I said earlier, because they're generally programmed one way, and then they try to make it where the soldier just has to press the talk, and then it works. And so the real key protocol that makes this happen is ALE, which is automatic link establishment. We've actually got it at the Army Cyber Institute. We've got all 3 of these radios, which I'm pretty excited about. We just recently got the 160 within the last year, and which is the bottom one. So the 138 was quite old, I think in the 80s. We had that radio, and then the 150 is what's most common, I think, fielded right now, which does 2G and 3G ALE, and not to be confused with the 3G cell phone. It's just a generation. So the second generation, third generation of automatic link establishment. And then the PRC 160, which is the newest one, a little bit smaller. And it actually interfaces quite well with the computer. The 150 had a lot more difficulty in doing that. And all of these do ALE. And so what am I talking about when I talk about ALE? So people get confused about this. Sometimes they think that we're doing frequency hopping. With HF, we really don't do a lot of frequency hopping. In VHF, we absolutely do that, which is good for, it gives some jam resistance when you frequency hop.
And the cool part about this is this guy is telling you about the network that I helped design when I was at CCOM with ALE, automatic link establishment, the use of Clover 2000 for the compression of the signal, and then they're using also the AES 256-bit encryption. So this guy is giving you a briefing from my office when I worked for CCOM, Communications and Electronics Command, because I was at Fort Monmouth when all this was being established. In fact, I used to put these up and actually put cellular antennas on tops of them at the same time. So I would use these as dual purpose, not only for HF communications, but for cellular communications. And I would have a cellular receive antenna on the top, a cellular receive transmit antenna on the bottom, and then I would have a multispectral antenna sitting somewhere else around. Have this up as my HF antenna, and then I would have my SINGARS inverted VV antennas up as well.
Really what we're talking about with ALE is just I hate to call it this, but it's kind of like a brute force way of establishing a link. So the two hurdles when you're establishing HF that you always have is frequency selection and of course the antenna type and the height of it. So what ALE does is it solves this first part, because instead of going in and well, ham operators probably just listen and they hear a station and maybe get on a DX cluster and say, oh wow, this is I'm receiving this, so this is where we're able to talk to. Or sometimes you'll go on, there's a VOA cap, and I've gone on plenty of times to say, okay, what would be the best frequency to operate this time of day? And it takes a while. It's not very user friendly, but you could figure it out, and you could say, okay, here's the ideal frequency for what we're doing. And I've done this in some of our testing that we've done that I'll show later in the presentation. But what you could do with ALE is you could just pre-program in all frequencies across the HF spectrum, and then what it'll do is it'll do this sounding, and it'll figure out, it'll try to connect to the other radio or the base station, and basically give a link quality assessment across each frequency. Then once that's completed, then you could just hit best call, and it'll automatically choose the frequency. And the soldier actually just sees channel number. They don't even see what frequency they're talking on. So they just see that it works. And that's really key, because if you think about a spectrum manager, there's going to be specialized people that are going to have to understand the HF spectrum. But if you think about a soldier in the field that's just trying to make comms for the commander, they're going to be stressed out with a lot of other things, and so you need it to work very quickly and very well. And that's what ALE does. As you see, I kind of created this diagram at the bottom. I like it because it helps visualize what's happening when you choose these frequencies. So the top frequency is the 21 megahertz, and you see that kind of shooting off with the orange. It's a little bit small, but shooting off through the ionosphere, because as you go up in frequency, you're likely to penetrate the ionosphere as you use like VHF and UHF with satellites. You don't want it to be absorbed or refracted. When you hit the sweet spot frequency, then that one comes back down, which in this case I have listed as these are just frequencies I've just made up here, 5.25. And then as you go too low in frequency, then you could possibly just get absorbed completely. So it's really critical. I'm going to mostly be talking about NIVIS communication, which is near vertical incident skywave, where you're really, you need all the ionosphere bouncing you can get, because you're going to be going up at a very steep angle and coming right back down. Okay, so antenna types. And as I mentioned earlier, I think Frank could probably give a better presentation on antennas here with his incredible setup. I was able to, I used to live in Maryland, and my sons were in, I went to a soccer place that must be nearby his house. And I remember the first time I saw it, I was like, holy cow, what is going on over here? But he's got a lot of neat towers, which you see on the far right with a Yagi. Those aren't technically field expedient. In the Army, we have to sometimes set up in a very a short time, get something ready to go, and communicate, and then move on. For NIVIS communication, we're typically looking at a dipolar inverted V, most likely inverted V, because it's just the easiest to set up. But there has been some research, and if anybody knew Dave, Lieutenant Colonel retired Dave Fiedler, he was a big HF proponent. Just before my time, I think he retired probably when I was being commissioned. And he's the one that devised this idea of saying, well, if you want to do NIVIS communication, you could just take a whip on a Humvee and you can tie it down, because now you have it parallel with the skyline, which is what you need to get that angle to be so steep to go up to the to do a NIVIS communication. So it's really, really critical. And I think this is the part of the HF renaissance that we're finally getting to, because for the last 20 years, all the Army does is like, well, just put an antenna on it and start transmitting. For VHF, that works. For vertical antenna, you're ready to go. But actually putting some thought into, where am I trying to communicate to? How should I set my antenna so that it gets the maximum power there? That is really like an essential piece that we have to train on. It's not something that you're going to be able to push an easy button on for sure. Okay, this is the part that's super exciting to me. Is as a computer scientist, I love the digital aspects of this, of radio in general, when we go back to the early times, you have what my old NCOs used to call it the rat rigs. You had these radio teletype, which was back in the 20s, and that was obviously the Navy. They relied probably more on HF than the Army does for long haul communication. And then really you started to see in the 70s AX25, which came from the X25 protocol. I think it's amateur X25. And that was packet radio. That was my first introduction into digital radio. I got this little Baypack modem and had an old computer that I was able to connect to DX clusters and some BBSs or bulletins places back when I lived in Texas. That's why I have the 5 call, by the way. That was really cool. And then Bob Berninga actually kept that alive by creating the APRS network after that, which is still like very widely used today. Then about the time I was graduating from West Point, Phase Shift King came out. I didn't have an HF radio at the time, so I wasn't quite into this at the time. I definitely got into it later on. PSK is a really cool protocol, but if anybody's ever operated it, they'll probably realize that it has no error correction. So you definitely get some weird things that happen with PSK 31. You'll start to see a sentence and then it'll kind of get garbled sometimes, and then it'll come back again, and that's just the fading that happens on HF. So if we look at the military side of things, we have the ALE uses MFSK frequency shift keying. So the 2G standard was in 99, and the 3.
And that's what I was doing at CCOM. Is this 2G ALE mil standard 188-41. Excuse me, 141B. So this is what I was working on when we were doing Clover 2000, so on and so forth at CCOM in Fort Monmouth.
3G standard was in 2011. So that's kind of a critical thing to think about when I hear people say, "Oh, HF is like old school comms, Cold War comms," is what a lot of people refer to it as. And yes, it was used in the Cold War, but it doesn't mean HF is Cold War comms. This standard, this 3G ALE, if anybody here's operated it, I know that there's a few people here that are probably Mars operators, and we got the chance to operate that in Noble Skywave this past year. And really, what's cool about the 3G standard is it's got all these other modes. So once you make a link to a station, you could say, "Oh, I'm just going to do digital," or "I'm going to do digital voice," or maybe it's a rough link and I'm going to go to a low data rate digital voice, which maybe sounds a little more digitized, but it'll still work. One thing I think is kind of fun to play with too, if you ever get a chance to operate a 3G ALE on a Harris radio, is there's a thing called LDV, which is last ditch voice. So basically, if you really can't make the contact, but you need to send a message, you can still, basically it records your voice and it sends it almost like a voicemail. So it'll sit there and slowly, over a very low data rate, send it across. And then once it's received, then it'll play it back for the other user. So those are the advances in the military, and obviously the most recent advances. And I got the privilege to listen to Joe Taylor speak at our local ARL Awards, regional awards this past, actually last week. So it's been a great week. And he created the JT65, and then eventually what caught on fire was FT8 in 2017 that got released. And now, if anybody here ever turns to 14074, 7074, you hear that the whole thing is just crowded with FT8 stations, just making a lot of contacts. It's a really, really cool mode. So I like to present that as just to show that, and I do this in our Army meetings as well, saying, hey, there's still advances being made. The ionosphere hasn't changed. The computers have gotten much better, and the digital encodings have just gotten to be amazing. So so that part I think is critical for people to understand that we're moving forward in HF. It's not something that's kind of stagnated. And the next thing I want to talk about is the back end of things. I remember, the internet started becoming a big thing around the time I started my military career, and the question became, what's the purpose of HF when you could just now do a voice over IP? I mean, look at us right now. We're all talking over the internet, all in different places across the U.S. What's going to happen to HF then? And I'd like to point out that the internet actually can help. And this is the part that's just super fascinating. The internet can help ham radio now, because now we can record and we can also locate where signals are going to. So if anybody hasn't done this before, this is the other part of FT8 that's super fun. If you think you have an antenna problem or a power problem and you're not making any contacts, you can always go to the pskreporter.info and you can see if your signal is being received. In this case, all of these stations are stations that received my signal either from when this screenshot was taken, either 2 hours ago or 27 minutes ago. So each one of those minutes is when that station last heard me, and they reported it to the reverse beacon network. So that to me is just another fascinating aspect of just collaborating these two means, the internet and HF, to be able to determine what's going on. It's a super fun thing if you want to really play with your antenna to make a transmission, make a modification to your antenna. Now you can go back and see, what did that do? What different stations received me now? So what a great tool, like great instant feedback, not just kind of hoping for the best and hoping you're making your transmission. You can now see what your antenna is actually doing and how well it's performing. The next thing I have to say is the bandwidth issue. So one of the reasons why, if HF had super high speed bandwidth, I don't know if we would be so concerned about doing satellites, because satellites do provide the bandwidth, but HF can't provide that. So we have to acknowledge that is the fact that you could do some data, but you're really looking at digital voice. You could do like email. I know some of you probably have done WinLink before. I've got a chance to play with that, which is super cool. So with that, it's important for us to not just make sure that our soldiers are trained on how to operate HF and how to set up an HF radio, but we've got to also train our commanders. We have to tell our commanders, look, when your satellite is cyber attacked and you can no longer communicate, there are other means to communicate, but you're going to have to think about the way you're going to communicate. Do you really need to do a VTC with the general to see his talking head on there? You really don't. What you need, though, is you may need to say, do we take this hill or not? Or my unit's at this location. There's very small amount of data that could be critically important in a battle, and that can still be passed over HF. So it's important for us to be able to know when we have an acronym called PACE. So it's primary, alternate, contingency, and emergency.
Apparently, separatisms are very frequent all over the globe at the present time. Every country in the world is loaded with regionalistic, nationalistic little groups.
But in Quebec, for example, they define it as the quest for identity.
Yes, all forms of violence are a quest for identity. When you live out on the frontier, you have no identity. You're a nobody. Therefore, you get very tough. You have to prove that you are somebody. And so you become very violent. And so identity is always accompanied by violence. This seems paradoxical to you? That ordinary people find the need for violence as they lose their identities. So it's only the threat to people's identity that makes them violence. Terrorists, hijackers, these are people minus identity. They are determined to make it somehow, to get coverage, to get noticed.
And all this is somehow an effect of the electronic age?
Oh, no. But people in all times have been this way. But in our time, when things happen very quickly, there's very little time to adjust to new situations at the speed of light. There's very little time to get accustomed to anything.
HF generally falls in that contingency emergency. But when you operate your PACE plan, you say, okay, now we're in emergency comms, you also have to change the way you command and control. At that point, you have to realize you're not sending, PowerPoints, you're going to be sending just text across. So a little bit of training that we have to do on our end to be able to explain that to commanders. Now, that being said, there is one example I have that's super cool that we've done some testing with, which is what if we tried to just abstract away the HF link completely? And so we did this this use case with John Rosico from Nivis Communications and Graham Kyle, and what they did is they used a Codan radio, which does do a 3G 3G ALE, and they had this thing called the Android Tactical Assault Kit. So one of the very important things that the Army has to know is where are my units, and we call it the Blue Force. So where you'll hear probably the term Blue Force Tracker. So where are my units at right now? And if their satellite goes down, then they need to do probably VHF. If they can't do that, then they need to do HF. Now, to abstract away that HF backbone, what they did is they showed an example of all of this is passed over this cell phone, over this Android Tactical Assault Kit, using either Wi-Fi, a local access point that connects to, or actual cell service. And as those units and stuff are moved, if there's a backbone that's the internet or some other high-speed satellite link, if that goes down and we have HF to fall back on, think about what the data has to be transferred. It doesn't have to be this map. The map's already loaded on the phone. What has to be transferred is where's that blue dot? Where are my units at? And so sending over just a unit designator and a grid coordinate is perfectly a perfect example of HF being able to do that. That's very, very easy to do because it's just a small amount of data, but it gives that visual picture at the end, and the user doesn't even have to know that we just switched to HF on the back end. So this is where I think we're going to be going as far as employing HF and making it seamless and easy to use for the military. Okay. I've already mentioned this a couple of times, and I did take this from Ben Whitfield. If you ever really, really want to know HF, he just did his PhD in Nivis Communication. He did his PhD in Nivis Communication. It's I haven't gotten through the whole thing yet, but he's got. I did get a chance to talk with him at one point, and what a fascinating individual who's done some remarkable work in really understanding how to do Nivis Communication. And so the next part of my talk here is I'm going to talk about some examples that we've done. Because, like I said before, if you think about it like a brigade combat team that's out in an area where there's obstacles in the way, the VHF comms aren't going to cover their whole footprint. They're going to need to use either satellite or Nivis communication. So it was discovered in the 1920s. The propagation was discovered during World War II as an essential means to establish communications in large war zones, such as the D-Day invasion in Normandy. So this isn't something new, and I've actually had people, when I've given this talk or talked about Nivis before, I've had ham radio operators say, well, what kind of specialized antenna do you need? And it's, a dipole's not really a special antenna, but a dipole can do that. And in this example, you can see the dipole is just transmitting straight up and then coming right back down. One misconception or myth of Nivis is people talk about skip zones. In Nivis, there's not really a skip zone, and I know when I've gone down to Penn State with Jim and Dr. Keith Lisiak, who I worked with, I think he recently retired. He was setting up these ionosons, which is a way to measure where the ionosphere is refracting your signal. Very fascinating piece of equipment, but it breaks that myth that people say that there's this skip zone. In Nivis, there's no skip. You can go 0 to 600 miles. You can go 15 miles, you can go 5 miles. In the case of the ionoson, you're going at a 90-degree angle straight up to the ionosphere and right back down. So there's absolutely no skip, and there's no missed coverage in NIVIS propagation. Okay, so what did we do at Army Cyber Institute? We said, well, what happens when our satellites go down? Let's go to the place that we think is the most accurate example of a deployment. If anybody is from California, you probably know or you've heard of the National Training Center at Fort Irwin. And I would say after being deployed to Iraq, this is probably the closest to the way I felt in Iraq when I got out there. You feel quite remote when you're in this desert. The great part of this desert is it has this terrain feature called the Tiferet Mountain, which this mountain prohibits you to do VHF across it. And we actually brought our VHF radios and did some testing just to verify that we could not talk VHF comms across this mountain. So we went out there and we actually used commercial radios. So we got a buddy pole and Elecraft with an amplifier, and basically just did what can we do with NIVIS, and what's the possibility? What is the data rates? What can we make work in this field exercise? So the places we set up was I was at transceiver 1, which it's a little bit hard to read. It's at the top of the map here, and at the bottom are 2 different positions. So we went to 2 different places just to test this out. And what we did is we first started out with voice communication. So we started at 100 watts. We made voice comms. We saw that the VHF comms didn't work. Then we went down to 50 watts. And we were able to make 50 watts.
All stations, this is out. Break. Lima, X-ray, Delta, Bravo, Zulu, Bravo, standby. Lima, X-ray, Delta, Bravo, Zulu, Bravo, standby. Lima, X-ray, Delta, Bravo, Zulu, Bravo, standby. Message follows. Lima, X-ray, Delta, Bravo, Zulu, Bravo, Juliet, 4,000 Lima, 4, Whiskey, 5, Papa, Zulu, Papa, Foxtrot, Zulu, 5, Golf, Delta, Whiskey, Victor, 7, Foxtrot, Lima, 4, Charlie, Uniform, Echo, I say again, Lima, X-ray, Delta, Bravo, Zulu, Bravo, Juliet, 4, Lima, 4, Whiskey, 5, Papa, Zulu, Papa, Foxtrot, Zulu, 5, Golf, Delta, Whiskey, Victor, 7, Foxtrot, Lima, 4, Charlie, Uniform.
They do have weapons that will destroy the United States. Now the question is how fast. One. Now, if you want to just take one weapon and one detonation to do the job, the EMP super weapon, right over, Omaha, Nebraska, maybe as far south as Kansas, could do the job. Taking out an entire national power grid. Ain't gonna happen. Oh, no, wait, I'm gonna show you some stuff. It could take out the entire national power grid. It won't kill anybody. No, not directly, but as a result of a total power failure, all our systems, hey, your bank account. Some people just forget this. They've already forgot about it. What all does it mean? our military bases get most of their power from local civilian power stations, and the grid has not been adequately hardened. Guys, they make all kind of excuses for not doing the job. I've chaired 2 power grid defense conferences. I'm involved in 2 separate power grid defense committees, and we know this very well. And we have real experts who are real scientists who study EMP, not the pseudoscientists, the EPRI and others, but for offering excuses for why they don't need to do anything, which some of the channels owners, my brethren channels, have bought in to their line, hook, line, and sinker. Oh, don't worry, your pretty little heads, we all got it covered. Okay, if that's what you want to believe, I run with the experts in these topics, guys. Hey, we got a lot of good people in the room tonight. 73 for this hour. Appreciate that. I see Lee's in the house. Howdy, Lee. So, guys, here's the deal. I'm going to show you this in a minute, but the EMP superweapon technology could totally devastate us. I'm going to show you a little snippet of a clip of the guy who tested a home, basically a $20,000 unit they built, basically a suitcase EMP operated maybe out of a van. They only put out 35,000 volts per meter, which is under the hardened spec, spec 188 to 125, most standard, excuse me. Guess what? The hardened military facilities were penetrated. They beat them with a lower level signal, far lower than what the Russians have available. And this is why your little trash can EMP protector may not work. This guy's did it. I'm going to show you a little snip of his video. And this is why you got to take this EMP threat seriously. 9 out of 10 Americans would die from societal collapse within a year, according to the Congressional EMP Task Force. Now, who was that? You want to sweep out of cycles? EPRI tells us we got nothing to worry about. Well, the EMP Task Force actually tested stuff. They ran a lot of tests, and they know what happens to stuff. They knew what happens to stuff. EPRI just sweeps that under the rug and says, oh no. Yeah, right, guys. And here's another thing. We had Starfish Prime experiment. And did you know that actually radio communications were knocked out for up to 18 hours as far away as Australia? Oh, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that they don't tell you. There's also the case that the Russians did a test of 184 over Kazakhstan. I'm going to show a little bit of that tonight, too. Everybody thought, oh, well, the underground's going to be good. You put cables underground, no. Undersea cables? No. Underground cables? No. Bzzz. Snap, crackle, pop, fry. So, these guys selling these little chintzy little boxes that's going to save your home from 42 EMPs. I got some special elixir for you. Hilarious. Absolutely hilarious. You know how many people are bought into that? And look, if I wanted to make money like I get accused of all the time, that's what I'd be selling, because I'd get like $200 per sale for that. Beats hands down anything else I promote. And, given I talk about EMP, I could sell them like hotcakes. I don't believe in that trash, okay? All right, guys. Oh, yeah, they're probably going to come after me. If they do, I'm going to fry some of their stuff just for fun, for giggles. And I'm going to come after them. I ain't got nothing to lose. I don't care.
All right, folks.
I've already lost everything. I am up to rumble.
I'm going to end this stream and start a new one on KLW World News.
How's everybody doing?
Just so you know. We'll be right back.
They did. They did, Lee. They absolutely did. Over Kazakhstan. Knuckleheads. Anyway, so they didn't know what it was going to do. And they'd heard of our Starfish Prime, but they did not. Look, people aren't believing, it'll do this. No, they don't believe it until it happens. All right, guys. So I'm going to show a little snip of a video here. Yeah. I'm going to share screen. Hope I don't show too much to get me in trouble. Oh, yeah, first, this is the guy, Patrushev. He's the one saying, hey, we got